Elijah sat at his desk, eagerly opening the brown paper bag his mother had packed that morning. The sun was shining through the classroom windows, and the smell of fresh sandwiches and fruit was making his stomach growl with anticipation. It was his favorite part of the day, the time when he could finally enjoy the lunch his mother made with so much love. But as he reached into the bag, his excitement turned to confusion. The sandwich, the apple, and the chips, all gone. The bag was empty, except for a small napkin that fluttered in the breeze from the open window. Elijah blinked. He looked around the classroom, trying to make sense of what had just happened. His heart began to race. This wasn't the first time his lunch had disappeared. Just yesterday, when he opened the bag, the sandwich had been missing, but there was still a half-eaten apple. This morning, he had double-checked to make sure his lunch was securely packed. But now, nothing. "Everything okay, Elijah?" Mrs. Thompson's voice came from behind him, snapping him out of his thoughts. She was standing at the front of the class, her arms crossed, a tight smile on her face. Elijah glanced up at her, feeling an uneasy chill crawl down his spine. Mrs. Thompson had always been a bit strange. She was the kind of teacher who never seemed to smile, never seemed to care much about the kids. And now, every time Elijah noticed her hovering near his desk, he felt an uncomfortable knot twist in his stomach. I think my lunch is missing again," Elijah muttered, looking down at the empty bag. His voice trembled slightly, though he tried his best to hide it. Mrs. Thompson's expression remained unchanged. "Well, that's strange, isn't it?" she said, her tone almost too casual. "You should be more careful with your things, Elijah." The word stung. It wasn't his fault. He had packed his lunch just like every other day. But before he could say anything, Mrs. Thompson turned away, focusing her attention on the rest of the class. Elijah sat back in his chair, his chest tight. He glanced at his friend, Jamal, who sat a few desks away. Jamal gave him a confused look, raising his eyebrows as if to say, "Did that really just happen?" Elijah didn't know what to think. This had been going on for weeks now. Every single day, his lunch would mysteriously disappear. He had hoped it was just a coincidence at first, but as the days went by, it started to feel like something much more deliberate. He couldn't understand why it was happening, and more than anything, he didn't know who to trust. He couldn't ask his mom about it, not yet. She would just think he was imagining things. And he wasn't sure how to explain it to anyone else without sounding crazy. As the lunch bell rang, Elijah gathered his things, trying to ignore the sinking feeling in his stomach. The classroom was buzzing with chatter as kids scrambled to grab their lunches, but Elijah couldn't bring himself to join in. He walked toward the lunchroom, his head down, heart still racing. He hated this feeling, the feeling of being invisible, of having something taken from him, and no one caring enough to even notice. In the lunchroom, Elijah sat at his usual seat, alone. Jamal hadn't arrived yet, and Elijah didn't want to draw any attention to himself. As he sat there, staring at the empty space in front of him where his lunch should have been, he felt a familiar pang of frustration. He opened his backpack and grabbed the small packet of crackers his mom had packed as a backup, but it didn't feel the same. It wasn't the sandwich, the apple, the treat he had looked forward to all morning. It was a reminder that something was wrong, and no one seemed to care. Just as he opened the packet of crackers, Jamal slid into the seat next to him, grinning. "Hey, man. You good?" Jamal asked, glancing down at Elijah's empty lunch bag with a raised eyebrow. "Where's your lunch?" Elijah sighed, picking at the crackers. "I don't know, man. It's gone again. Just like yesterday." Jamal's grin faded, and his expression turned serious. He leaned in, his voice low. "Wait, what do you mean, gone again?" Elijah glanced around the lunchroom, making sure no one was listening. "I think Mrs. Thompson is stealing it," he whispered, barely above a whisper. Jamal looked at him, wide-eyed, and then glanced around the lunchroom as if to make sure no one had overheard. "Mrs. Thompson? Seriously?" Elijah nodded, swallowing hard. "I don't know what else to think. She's always near my desk, and my lunch always goes missing when she's around. It's happened every day this week." Jamal sat back in his chair, his eyes narrowing. "That's messed up. Why would she do that?" "I don't know," Elijah whispered, feeling embarrassed by how small his voice sounded. "But I've got to find out. I can't keep pretending it's not happening." Jamal didn't say anything for a moment. He just sat there, looking at Elijah with a mixture of concern and confusion. Then, slowly, he nodded. "Okay, we'll figure it out, man. We'll catch her in the act." Elijah didn't know what to say. Part of him wanted to believe that Jamal was right, that they could figure it out. But another part of him felt the weight of the situation. This wasn't just about food. This was about being seen, about being treated with respect. And if no one was going to help him, then maybe it was up to him to do something about it. That afternoon, as Elijah packed his bag to leave for the day, his mind raced. He had to find a way to catch Mrs. Thompson in the act, to prove that she was the one taking his lunch. But how? He had no evidence, no way to prove it to anyone. He could already hear the voices in his head telling him it was all in his imagination. He could hear his mother's voice, telling him to stop being so sensitive, that things like this happen all the time. But Elijah wasn't going to let it go. Not anymore. As he left the school building, he spotted his dad's old car parked outside. Marcus, his father, was waiting to pick him up. Elijah waved, trying to push the thoughts out of his head. His dad had always taught him that when things got tough, you had to stand tall. You had to face it head on. And that's exactly what Elijah was going to do. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? Elijah's house wasn't anything fancy, but to him, it was the most comforting place in the world. The worn-out furniture, the smell of his mother's cooking wafting through the air, and the sound of his father humming as he worked on the car in the garage. It was home, the one place where Elijah always felt safe, loved, and understood. His father, Marcus, was a big man, tall, broad-shouldered, with hands that seemed made for hard work. But it was his eyes that made him special, deep, kind, and always filled with an unspoken wisdom. Marcus worked long hours as a mechanic, fixing cars at the local garage, but no matter how late he came home, he always made time for Elijah. They'd talk about everything, sports, school, the world, and whatever was on Elijah's mind. To Elijah, his dad wasn't just a father, he was his hero. Elijah's mother, Rosa, was the backbone of their home. She had a laugh that could light up the entire house, and her smile was always so warm, it made everything feel right. She worked as a nurse, often working long shifts at the local hospital, but she always made sure Elijah knew how much she loved him. She was the practical one, steady, strong, and full of wisdom. But when it came to Elijah, there was a softness in her eyes that made him feel safe. That evening, after school, Elijah was quiet as he sat at the kitchen table, picking at his food. Rosa was bustling around, preparing dinner, and Marcus had just come in from the garage, wiping his hands on a rag. Elijah's mind kept drifting back to the events of the day, his lunch going missing again, Mrs. Thompson's strange behavior, and the knot in his stomach that wouldn't go away. Marcus noticed his son's silence right away. He always could tell when something was off with Elijah, even when the boy tried to hide it. Sitting down across from him, Marcus leaned back in his chair, folding his arms. "What's going on, son? You've been quiet all evening." Elijah hesitated. He wanted to tell his dad, but he didn't know how. What if his father didn't believe him? What if he thought he was overreacting? "Nothing," Elijah mumbled, but his voice lacked the usual confidence. Marcus raised an eyebrow. "Elijah, you know you can talk to me about anything, right? You've got a lot on your plate, I can see it. What happened today? Elijah fiddled with his spoon, his fingers tapping nervously on the edge of the bowl. He wanted to say something, but his mind was a whirlwind of doubt. The thought of telling his dad about Mrs. Thompson stealing his lunch seemed almost impossible. What if it made everything worse? It's nothing, Elijah said again, his voice quieter this time. Rosa, overhearing their conversation, turned around from the stove. She wiped her hands on her apron and walked over to Elijah, kneeling beside his chair. Elijah, honey, you don't have to keep things to yourself. What's going on? For a moment, Elijah felt a wave of frustration build up in his chest. His parents were great, amazing, even, but sometimes it felt like they didn't fully understand what he was going through. They didn't know what it was like to feel invisible at school, to feel like no one cared. But this time, something was different. Elijah took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. He looked at his parents, both of them waiting for him to speak, their faces full of concern. Mom, Dad. I think Mrs. Thompson's been stealing my lunch, Elijah blurted out, his voice shaking slightly. It's been happening for a while now, and I don't know what to do. For a moment, there was silence in the room. Rosa and Marcus exchanged a look, both of them trying to process what Elijah had just said. It was as if time itself had paused. Elijah could see the confusion and concern in their eyes, and his heart sank. He had expected something like this. He had expected them to brush it off, to tell him he was imagining things. Stealing your lunch? Rosa repeated, her tone filled with disbelief. She looked at Marcus, then back at Elijah. Are you sure? Elijah nodded, his stomach twisting. I've seen her near my desk, and every time my lunch goes missing, she's always around. I don't know how else to explain it. I think she's taking it. Marcus leaned forward, his face serious. Son, are you sure about this? I'm not saying I don't believe you, but it's a big accusation. You know we have to be certain before we do anything. Elijah's frustration bubbled up again. I don't know what to do, Dad. It's happening every day. I don't know how to prove it, but I swear it's her. His voice cracked slightly. It's like no one cares, like no one's listening. Rosa placed a gentle hand on Elijah's shoulder, her voice softening. Elijah, honey, I know you're upset, but we can't jump to conclusions. We need to handle this carefully. Maybe you're just misunderstanding something, okay? Let's talk to your teacher. If it's really happening, we'll figure it out. Elijah shook his head. I've tried. But every time I mention it, she brushes me off. No one takes me seriously. Marcus leaned back in his chair, his face thoughtful. He had always taught Elijah that if something wasn't right, you had to stand up for it, even when it was difficult. Marcus had faced his share of struggles growing up, he knew what it was like to feel unheard, to feel like you didn't matter. You don't have to fight this alone, son, Marcus said slowly. I'll help you figure this out. We'll make sure you're treated fairly. Elijah felt a sense of relief wash over him. It wasn't just his problem anymore, it was a family problem. His dad was going to help him, and for the first time in a while, Elijah felt like maybe things could get better. I'll talk to your teacher tomorrow, Elijah, Marcus said. But we need to gather some proof first. We need to be smart about this, okay? Elijah nodded, feeling a small spark of hope for the first time in weeks. Maybe, just maybe, they could get to the bottom of this. Maybe they could stop Mrs. Thompson from taking his lunch, and maybe, just maybe, it would be the first step toward standing up for what was right. As Marcus and Rosa continued to discuss their plan, Elijah felt a sense of determination growing inside him. No matter what it took, he was going to make sure the truth came out. He wouldn't let anyone, especially Mrs. Thompson, get away with treating him like this. His father had always taught him that strength wasn't just about physical power, it was about doing the right thing, no matter how hard it was. And right now, standing up for himself and for what was right was the hardest thing Elijah had ever faced. The next day, Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that something was going to change. With his parents' support, he had a renewed sense of determination, though he still wasn't sure how they were going to prove that Mrs. Thompson had been stealing his lunch. His mind raced with ideas as he got ready for school, the same nervous energy bubbling up in his chest. The thought of confronting his teacher made him uneasy, but he knew it was the only way forward. As he finished eating breakfast, his dad, Marcus, came into the kitchen. His face was serious, but there was a hint of encouragement in his eyes. "Remember, Elijah," Marcus said, "we'll need to be smart about this. Watch her closely today. Keep an eye on what's happening, and if you can, try to catch her in the act. But make sure you stay calm. This isn't about getting her in trouble, it's about showing what's really going on." Elijah nodded, the weight of the situation sinking in. It wasn't just about a missing lunch anymore, it was about standing up for himself. He had to stay calm and smart, like his dad said, but inside, he was feeling a storm of emotions. What if Mrs. Thompson saw him watching her? What if she figured out what he was doing? His mother, Rosa, kissed him on the forehead before he left, smiling gently. "We'll be here when you get back, no matter what happens. Just do your best, okay?" Elijah managed a small smile. "I will, Mom. Thanks." As he walked out the door, Marcus called after him, "We've got your back, son. Don't forget that." At school, Elijah's mind was buzzing with ideas. The morning passed by in a blur of lessons and schoolwork, but every time Mrs. Thompson came near his desk, he felt a pit in his stomach. He had to be careful. Every time she looked his way, he had to act normal, not draw attention. It was getting harder to concentrate on his work, his thoughts kept drifting to what was going on with his lunch. By the time the lunch bell rang, Elijah was already on edge. He didn't want to sit at his usual spot, not today. He decided to hang back, pretending to finish up some homework he hadn't done earlier. Jamal caught his eye from across the room, giving him a small wave. Elijah nodded, signaling that he'd be there in a moment, but he wasn't ready to go to the cafeteria yet. As the classroom cleared, Elijah followed Mrs. Thompson's movements with his eyes, watching her every step. It was almost like she knew he was watching her, but she didn't acknowledge it. She went about her usual routine, keeping a steady eye on the clock as the students filed out, but Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. She was too calm, too controlled. The lunchroom was quieter than usual when Elijah entered, and he made his way to an empty corner of the room. He set his things down and pulled out a notebook to doodle, not looking at his bag. He wasn't hungry anymore. Not really. He just wanted to observe. After a few minutes, he saw Mrs. Thompson walk in, glancing around as she entered. Elijah's stomach tightened. He had never really thought much about her movements before, but today he was focused. He watched her make her way to the far side of the lunchroom, where she stood talking to another teacher. They spoke in low voices, too quietly for Elijah to hear. It didn't seem unusual at first, but as he watched, something caught his attention. Mrs. Thompson kept glancing in his direction, her eyes scanning the room. He felt a sense of unease as the lunch period wore on. He kept his eyes trained on her, knowing that something wasn't right, but still unsure of what exactly to look for. It wasn't until the final minutes of lunch that things took an unexpected turn. Elijah noticed Mrs. Thompson approaching his table, her footsteps slow and deliberate. His heart began to race. She was too close. Was she really about to take his lunch right here in front of him? He tried to act normal, not giving away his suspicions, but inside, his pulse was pounding. Just as she neared his bag, Elijah took a deep breath. He could feel the weight of his decision hanging in the air. This was it. This was the moment he had been waiting for. He had to do something. But then, without saying a word, Mrs. Thompson walked right past his table, moving toward another student's lunch. Elijah blinked, confused. What had just happened? Had he misread the situation? She was acting so strangely, it was hard to figure out her next move. As she took a seat at the teacher's table across the room, Elijah quickly glanced down at his own lunch bag. His heart stopped. There, in the corner of his bag, he saw something that didn't belong, a small, crumpled-up napkin, stained with mustard. It looked just like the napkins his mom always packed for him, but the mustard stain wasn't from anything he'd eaten that day. Elijah's stomach turned. He knew that napkin wasn't his. It had to be hers. Mrs. Thompson had been near his bag. He had seen her. And now, here was the proof. He couldn't help but feel sick to his stomach. He had known it all along, but seeing that napkin was like seeing a dark secret laid bare. The evidence was right there, staring him in the face. Mrs. Thompson had been taking his lunch. And it wasn't a mistake, it was deliberate. Jamal arrived at the table, sensing Elijah's discomfort. "What's up, man?" he asked, glancing at Elijah's expression. "You look like you just saw a ghost." Elijah didn't respond at first. He just stared at the napkin in his bag, his thoughts racing. The truth was finally clear. Mrs. Thompson had been stealing his lunch every day. Jamal followed Elijah's gaze, noticing the napkin. "No way. She really did it, huh?" Elijah nodded slowly, his heart still hammering in his chest. "I don't know what to do now." Jamal frowned. "You need to tell someone. This isn't right, Elijah. You've got the proof." But Elijah wasn't sure what to do. He felt like the walls were closing in on him. Mrs. Thompson was the teacher, the one who held all the power in the classroom. What if no one believed him? What if they sided with her? He knew he couldn't just ignore it. But the fear of what might happen next weighed heavily on him. He had a choice to make. The plan was clear now, but the next step, what he would do with the evidence, was more complicated than he could have imagined. The rest of lunch passed in a haze for Elijah. He barely touched his food, his mind racing with 100 different thoughts. The napkin, small, seemingly insignificant, had felt like a weight around his neck. He had proof now. Proof that Mrs. Thompson had been stealing his lunch every day. But what was he supposed to do with it? How could he confront her without making things worse? Jamal sat quietly across from him, watching Elijah's internal struggle. The two of them had been friends for years, but Jamal could tell that something was bothering Elijah, something big. "Yo, you okay?" Jamal finally asked, his voice gentle but firm. "You're acting like you just saw a ghost." Elijah took a deep breath, pushing the napkin further into his bag. "I've got proof, Jamal. I know it sounds crazy, but Mrs. Thompson, she's been stealing my lunch. Every day." Jamal's eyes widened, a mix of disbelief and anger flashing across his face. "Are you serious? That's messed up, man." "I know," Elijah replied, his voice quieter now. "But what am I supposed to do? If I tell anyone, they're just going to think I'm making it up. She's a teacher, Jamal. She's the one in charge." Jamal leaned in, his expression serious. "But you've got the evidence now, right? That napkin. You can't just let her get away with it." "That's not right." Elijah shook his head. "I don't know. What if no one believes me? What if they think I'm lying? What if she gets mad and makes things worse?" Jamal gave him a hard look. "Do you really want to let her get away with it? Stealing your lunch every day? If you don't say something, you're just letting her keep doing it." Elijah knew Jamal was right. But the fear still lingered. Mrs. Thompson was a teacher. She was an adult. She was supposed to be the one who was in charge, who was trusted. And here he was, a kid, accusing her of something as serious as stealing. But as he sat there, staring at the crumpled napkin in his bag, he realized something. This wasn't just about a lunch anymore. It was about respect. It was about standing up for himself. And if he didn't do something now, he'd never feel like he had control over his own life. Taking a deep breath, Elijah looked at Jamal. Okay, you're right. I can't just let this go. But I can't do it alone. Jamal nodded. You've got me, man. Let's do this together. The next morning, Elijah's stomach twisted as he prepared for school. Today was the day. Today, he would go to the principal with the napkin and tell him everything. His heart raced, and the fear that had been building up in him for days threatened to take over. What if the principal didn't believe him? What if Mrs. Thompson somehow convinced everyone it was all a misunderstanding? Still, Elijah knew he couldn't back down. Not now. He had already come this far. His parents had been supportive, Jamal was behind him, and he had the evidence in his bag. This was the right thing to do. As he arrived at school, he met Jamal in the hallway, both of them looking nervous but determined. You ready for this? Jamal asked, his voice low. Elijah nodded. I don't know if I'll ever be ready, but I can't just stay quiet anymore. Together, they made their way to the principal's office, their footsteps echoing in the empty hallway. Elijah felt his heart pounding in his chest as they approached the door. This was it. There was no turning back now. As they walked into the office, the secretary greeted them with a friendly smile, but Elijah could see the concern in her eyes when she noticed the serious expressions on their faces. Can I help you, Elijah? She asked gently. I need to talk to Principal Harris, Elijah said, his voice shaky but firm. It's important. The secretary looked at him for a moment, her brow furrowing in concern, before picking up the phone. A few moments later, the principal's office door opened, and Principal Harris, a tall man in his 40s with salt and pepper hair and glasses, appeared. Elijah, Jamal, what's going on? He asked, his tone warm but professional. You two look like you've got something important to say. Elijah swallowed hard, his throat dry. I think something's happening in class. Something wrong. Something I need to tell you about. Principal Harris raised an eyebrow, his expression shifting from casual to concerned. All right. Let's sit down and talk about it. They followed him into the office, where the principal sat behind his desk and motioned for them to sit across from him. Elijah's hands were clammy as he pulled the napkin from his bag and placed it on the desk. This napkin is for my lunch, Elijah said, his voice barely above a whisper. It wasn't there when I packed my lunch. I found it in my bag one day, and I think Mrs. Thompson has been taking my lunch. Principal Harris stared at the napkin for a moment, his expression unreadable. Elijah, I need you to tell me everything. I'm listening. Elijah took a deep breath. He told Principal Harris everything, about the missing lunches, about Mrs. Thompson's behavior, about how he had tried to talk to her but hadn't been able to get anyone to believe him. He explained how he had watched her carefully, how the napkin had been the final piece of the puzzle. When he finished, there was a long silence in the room. Principal Harris leaned back in his chair, his fingers tapping gently on the desk as he processed everything. I appreciate you coming forward with this, Elijah, he said finally, his voice calm and serious. This is a very serious accusation, and we need to make sure we handle it the right way. I'm going to investigate this thoroughly. Elijah felt a wave of relief wash over him. The weight that had been pressing down on him for so long seemed to lift, if only a little. He had done it. He had stood up for himself. Now, it was in the principal's hands. That afternoon, as Elijah left school, Jamal caught up with him outside. How do you feel? Jamal asked, his grin wide. Elijah paused, taking a deep breath. For the first time in days, he felt a glimmer of hope. I feel better. Like I've done the right thing. Jamal bumped his shoulder against Elijah's. You did, man. You really did. As they walked home together, Elijah thought about the next steps, what would happen next, how the investigation would go, and whether Mrs. Thompson would be held accountable. But for now, he felt something he hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of control. He had taken the first step in a journey that would change his life forever. The next few days at school felt like they were moving in slow motion. Elijah couldn't stop thinking about the conversation with Principal Harris. The weight of what he had done, the choice to stand up to Mrs. Thompson, felt heavier than ever. As the days passed, though, he noticed something strange. Mrs. Thompson had been acting differently. It was subtle, but she seemed to avoid looking him in the eye. She was more quiet than usual, less of her usual forceful self. For the first time since all of this started, Elijah felt like maybe, just maybe, things might be working out in his favor. He hadn't heard from Principal Harris yet, but Elijah knew that it was only a matter of time before the investigation began. He kept his fingers crossed, praying that it wouldn't be swept under the rug. If there was one thing he was sure of now, it was that he wasn't going to let this go. The following Monday, Principal Harris pulled Elijah aside after the first period. "Elijah," he said, his voice calm but serious, "I've spoken with Mrs. Thompson, and I've also reviewed your claims. I'm going to need you to meet with me and a few other school officials tomorrow to discuss the situation further." Elijah's heart skipped a beat. "Tomorrow? Will Mrs. Thompson be there?" Principal Harris nodded. "Yes, we'll all be in the same room. But I need you to know that we'll be investigating this thoroughly. You've done the right thing by coming forward." Elijah nodded, trying to hide the nervousness in his stomach. He had no idea what would happen next, but he knew he couldn't back down. He thought about how his parents had supported him all this time, how Jamal had been there every step of the way. They had his back. That night, after dinner, Elijah sat with his parents at the kitchen table. He could see the concern in their eyes, but there was also pride. "How are you feeling, Elijah?" his mom, Rosa, asked softly. "I know this is a big deal. You've been so brave." Elijah nodded. "I'm nervous, Mom. What if no one believes me? What if they just think I'm making it up?" Marcus, his dad, placed a hand on Elijah's shoulder. "Son, you did the right thing by speaking up. The truth is on your side, and that's all that matters. We'll be there with you tomorrow, every step of the way. You've got nothing to fear." Elijah felt a little better, but the nervous energy still buzzed through him. He had no idea what to expect the next day, but he knew that there was no turning back. The truth would come out, whether Mrs. Thompson liked it or not. The next morning, as he walked into school, Elijah felt a mixture of fear and anticipation. It was the day of the meeting. The day when everything would either come to light, or go horribly wrong. When he arrived at the principal's office, he saw Mrs. Thompson sitting in a chair just outside. Her arms were crossed tightly over her chest, her face a mask of composure. She didn't look at Elijah when he entered. He couldn't help but feel a little bit of satisfaction at the sight of her discomfort. For once, it was her who seemed nervous. Principal Harris ushered him into his office, where two other adults were already seated, Mr. Jensen, the assistant principal, and Ms. Gibbons, the school counselor. "Elijah, I'm glad you could make it," Principal Harris said, motioning for him to sit in the chair across from him. Elijah sat down, feeling a little bit like he was about to be put on trial, but he reminded himself that he was the one telling the truth. He was the one standing up for what was right. "I want to make sure that we're all clear on what we're here to discuss today," Principal Harris began. "Elijah has come forward with a serious accusation against Mrs. Thompson. We've reviewed the evidence, and we're here to get the full story from everyone involved." He turned his attention to Mrs. Thompson, who hadn't spoken yet. She shifted in her seat, but her face remained neutral. "Mrs. Thompson," Principal Harris said, "I want to give you the chance to speak. Elijah has shared his concerns, and we'd like to hear your side of things." For a moment, there was silence. Mrs. Thompson finally spoke, her voice low but controlled. "I've been teaching for over 15 years, she said slowly. "I've never had a situation like this before. I don't know what Elijah's talking about. I haven't taken his lunch. I've been teaching my class, and I've been focused on my students, as always. I don't know what he thinks he saw, but I've done nothing wrong." Elijah felt his heart pounding in his chest. Her words were calm, calculated, and filled with confidence. But he wasn't backing down. He knew the truth. "I'm not lying," Elijah said, his voice steady, though his hands were shaking. "I saw her near my lunch every day. And that napkin, it wasn't mine. I know what I saw, and I know what's been happening." Mrs. Thompson's eyes flashed for a moment, but she quickly masked her expression again. It was as if she hadn't expected Elijah to be so firm. "Well," she said, her tone suddenly colder, "it seems there's been some kind of misunderstanding here. Maybe Elijah just misplaced his lunch or didn't pack it properly. I assure you, I've been teaching my students and haven't had time to go around taking anyone's lunch." Principal Harris didn't seem convinced. He turned to Mr. Jensen, who had been quietly taking notes throughout the conversation. "Mr. Jensen, can you confirm the timeline of the lunches Elijah reported missing?" he asked. Mr. Jensen nodded and looked down at his notes. "Yes, we've checked the records. The lunches have been missing every day around the time Mrs. Thompson is in the classroom. And the napkin, though small, seems to be consistent with the mustard-stained napkins Elijah's mother uses for his lunches." Ms. Givens, the counselor, chimed in softly. "It's important to note that Elijah's actions in coming forward have been brave. This isn't easy for any student, especially one who has to accuse a teacher. We need to take these claims seriously." The tension in the room was palpable. Elijah felt a strange sense of calm wash over him. He had done it. He had told the truth, and it was finally being heard. No one was brushing him off this time. Principal Harris nodded slowly, his expression serious. "We'll be conducting further investigations, but for now, Mrs. Thompson, I expect you to cooperate fully. We'll be monitoring this situation closely." Mrs. Thompson opened her mouth to argue, but Principal Harris held up a hand. "This is not up for debate. I expect a full investigation, and I expect cooperation. Is that clear?" She hesitated for a moment before nodding curtly. "Yes, Principal Harris." As the meeting came to a close, Elijah stood up, his legs a little shaky but his heart lighter. He had done it. He had stood up for himself and told the truth, and now, the school was taking him seriously. Principal Harris looked at Elijah with a nod of approval. "You did the right thing, Elijah. We'll get to the bottom of this." The following days felt like a whirlwind for Elijah. The weight of what had happened was still sinking in, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like things might actually change. Principal Harris's promise to investigate the situation had given him a glimmer of hope. His parents had been supportive, Jamal had been his rock, and even the other students seemed to take notice. But as the investigation into Mrs. Thompson continued, things started to shift in unexpected ways. The next afternoon, during lunch, Elijah was sitting with Jamal when he noticed Mrs. Thompson walking past the cafeteria. Her eyes briefly met his, and Elijah swore he saw a flicker of something: anger? Disappointment? He couldn't tell. She quickly turned away, her pace quickening. Elijah felt his stomach churn. What if she came after him? What if things got worse now that the school was looking into her? "You okay, man?" Jamal asked, noticing the uneasy look on Elijah's face. Elijah swallowed hard. "I don't know. It feels like something's going to happen. I can feel it." Jamal leaned forward, his voice low. "You've done the right thing. You can't back down now. But I'm with you, no matter what." Elijah nodded, but the uneasy feeling stayed with him. It was almost as if he could feel the tension in the air every time Mrs. Thompson was near. It wasn't just her, though. Even some of the other teachers seemed to avoid him. Was it because of the accusation? Did they think he was lying, or worse, was he making things harder for the school? As they finished lunch, a voice broke through his thoughts. "Hey, Elijah," a soft voice called out. It was Emily, a girl from his English class. She was one of the few who had always been kind to him, and her gentle smile gave Elijah a sense of comfort. "Can I talk to you for a second?" Elijah hesitated, but then nodded. "Sure. What's up?" Emily looked around nervously before sitting down beside him. "I just wanted to say, I think it's really brave what you did. Standing up to Mrs. Thompson and everything. I know people are saying stuff behind your back, but I want you to know I don't think you're lying." Elijah blinked, taken aback. "Thanks, Emily. That means a lot." "I know it's hard," she said quietly, "but don't let the rumors get to you. I've seen the way she treats some of the other kids. It's not right." Elijah's heart swelled with appreciation. Emily wasn't just giving him empty words, she was acknowledging the truth of the situation. And maybe, just maybe, there were more people who believed him than he realized. That evening, when Elijah got home, he found his parents waiting for him in the living room. His mom was sitting on the couch, flipping through a magazine, while his dad was reading the newspaper. When they saw him, they immediately sat up straight, concern etched on their faces. "Hey, Bud," Marcus said, setting the paper down. "How was school today?" Elijah took a deep breath, his heart heavy. "It was weird. Mrs. Thompson's acting like she's pissed at me, and some of the teachers are, too. I'm getting a lot of looks from people, and it's freaking me out. I don't know what's going to happen next." Rosa stood up and walked over to Elijah, placing a hand on his shoulder. "We knew this wouldn't be easy. But we also know you did the right thing. You didn't do anything wrong, Elijah. And no matter what, we've got your back. We'll figure this out together." "I know, Mom. But it just feels like things are getting worse. Like I've made it worse." Marcus gave a small smile, trying to comfort him. "Sometimes doing the right thing means going through some tough times, son. But in the end, it's always worth it. You'll see." The words didn't completely calm Elijah's nerves, but they helped. His parents were right. He had done the right thing. And no matter how difficult it got, he couldn't back down now. The following morning, Elijah and Jamal were walking to class when they were stopped in the hallway by Ms. Gibbons, the school counselor. She gave Elijah a small, reassuring smile before speaking. "Elijah, I just wanted to let you know that the investigation is ongoing, and we're doing everything we can to get to the bottom of this. But I also want to remind you that this process can take time. You did the right thing by speaking up." Elijah nodded, feeling a little more reassured by her kind words. "Thanks, Ms. Gibbons. I just don't know what's going to happen next." She looked at him with understanding. "That's normal. But you've taken the first step. And I believe it'll lead to positive changes, for you and for others." Just then, they heard the bell ring, signaling the start of class. Jamal patted Elijah on the back. "Don't worry, man. You're doing great." As they walked into their classroom, Elijah's mind couldn't help but wander back to Mrs. Thompson. He knew the school would take action, but he also knew it wouldn't be easy. There would be more challenges ahead, more people who would question him, more teachers who would avoid him, and more whispers behind his back. But he couldn't let that stop him. He had to see this through. The days continued to drag on, and the rumors about Elijah spread. Some students avoided him, while others whispered as he passed. But there were also whispers of support. Emily spoke to him more often, and a few other classmates came up to him to say they believed him. They hadn't seen what he had seen, but they knew what kind of teacher Mrs. Thompson was. And that gave Elijah some comfort. Then, on Friday afternoon, just as the school day was coming to an end, Principal Harris called Elijah down to the office. His heart raced as he walked through the hallways, wondering what he was about to hear. When he entered Principal Harris's office, the principal was sitting behind his desk, a serious expression on his face. Mrs. Thompson was sitting across from him, looking tense. "Elijah, I'm glad you could join us," Principal Harris said. "We've concluded our investigation, and we need to have a conversation." Elijah took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the moment. This was it, the moment that would either confirm everything he'd been through or send it all spiraling down. Elijah sat in the uncomfortable chair across from Principal Harris, trying to keep his composure, though his heart was racing. Mrs. Thompson sat with her arms crossed, a tight, controlled expression on her face. Elijah could tell she wasn't happy to be here, but there was something else in her eyes, something like fear, though she was doing her best to hide it. Principal Harris cleared his throat and adjusted his glasses. "Elijah, as you know, we've been conducting a thorough investigation into the accusations you've made against Mrs. Thompson. It hasn't been an easy process, but we've now reviewed all the evidence, spoken to other students, and gone through your claims very carefully." Elijah tried to stay calm, but the tension in the room was almost unbearable. His fingers clenched around the armrests of the chair. He was terrified of what would happen next, but he was also certain that he had done the right thing by speaking up. He just hoped the truth would prevail. After what felt like an eternity, Principal Harris spoke again. "We found significant evidence to support Elijah's claims. Several students confirmed that Mrs. Thompson was seen taking lunches from the classroom on multiple occasions. Additionally, there's a record of the mustard-stained napkins Elijah mentioned, which have been linked to the lunch thefts." Elijah's stomach twisted in relief and disbelief at the same time. He had known it all along, but hearing it confirmed in front of him, in such a formal setting, made everything seem more real. Mrs. Thompson's face paled as she sat up straighter in her chair, but she said nothing. Elijah could tell she was trying to compose herself, but it was clear that the weight of the situation was sinking in. Principal Harris continued. "We also had several staff members confirm that there were incidents where Mrs. Thompson was seen leaving the classroom during lunchtime in a way that raised suspicions. And, most importantly, the napkin you described was not just any napkin, it matched the brand used by your mother, which was another key piece of evidence." The room fell silent for a moment. Elijah could hear his heart pounding in his ears. This was happening. The truth was coming out. Mrs. Thompson finally spoke, her voice barely a whisper. "I didn't mean for it to get out of hand. I didn't mean for it to go this far." Elijah felt a surge of anger. Was she really trying to justify what she had done? Was she going to minimize everything? "You took my lunch every day, Mrs. Thompson," Elijah said, his voice shaking but firm. "You stole from me, and you made me feel like I wasn't good enough. How could you do that to me?" Mrs. Thompson's eyes flickered toward him, but she quickly looked away. She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. Instead, she looked down at her lap, her hands clasped tightly together. Principal Harris stood up, his voice authoritative. "Mrs. Thompson, based on the evidence we've gathered, I regret to inform you that your actions are in violation of the school's code of conduct. Stealing from students is unacceptable, and it undermines the trust that is essential between a teacher and a student." He turned to Elijah then, his expression softer. "Elijah, I want to apologize on behalf of the school for what you've gone through. No student should ever feel unsafe or disrespected by a teacher. You did the right thing by speaking up, even when it was hard. I want you to know that this won't be tolerated here." Elijah's chest tightened with a mixture of relief and disbelief. He had done it. The truth had won. Mrs. Thompson was being held accountable for what she had done. But the moment was bittersweet. Even though he had been vindicated, he couldn't shake the feeling that something would never quite be the same again. Mrs. Thompson had been a figure of authority, someone who should have been a mentor, and now, that trust was shattered. As Elijah left Principal Harris's office, he felt a strange sense of finality. He had fought for what was right, and now, the truth had been exposed. But as he walked down the hallway, he felt a pang of guilt. He couldn't help but wonder if Mrs. Thompson would ever truly change. If she would ever understand what she had done to him, to all the students she had hurt. Jamal was waiting for him by the lockers, his usual wide grin on his face. "Yo, man, I heard. You did it. You really did it." Elijah couldn't help but smile, though it was tinged with exhaustion. "Yeah, it's over now. Mrs. Thompson's gone, and she's not coming back." Jamal slapped him on the back. "You're a hero, Elijah. For real. You stood up to her, and you didn't back down. A lot of people wouldn't have had the guts to do that." Elijah felt a warmth spread through him at Jamal's words. It was true, he had stood up to a powerful figure. But he couldn't shake the feeling that something bigger was at play here. This wasn't just about him. It was about standing up for what was right, for making sure that no one else had to suffer in silence. It was about creating a space where the truth was valued, where students like him didn't feel small or powerless. As the bell rang, signaling the end of the school day, Elijah walked toward the exit, feeling the weight of everything he had been through lift from his shoulders. But he knew it wasn't over. There was still more to do, more to fight for. He wasn't done making a difference. He was just getting started. At home that evening, Elijah sat down at the kitchen table, a sense of peace settling over him for the first time in weeks. His parents had already heard the news, and they were proud of him, but Elijah knew that this victory wasn't just his own. It was a victory for all the students who had ever been silenced or ignored. His mom smiled warmly at him. "How do you feel, Elijah?" Elijah took a deep breath and looked around the kitchen, feeling grounded. "I feel like I can finally breathe. Like I've done what I needed to do. But more than that, I feel like we've all done something important. I didn't do this alone." His dad nodded in agreement. "No, you didn't. We all stood by you, and you had a whole lot of people supporting you. And now you've shown everyone that standing up for yourself is worth it." Elijah smiled, looking around at his family. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about a message, that standing up for what's right, no matter the consequences, was the most important thing anyone could do. The following days at school felt oddly different. Elijah had become something of a local hero, at least among the students. In the cafeteria, students who used to avoid him or ignore him now approached with supportive smiles and nods. Word had spread quickly about what he had done, and for the first time, he felt seen. But along with the attention came the pressure of knowing that not everyone agreed with what he had done. Some students who had once been indifferent to Elijah now whispered behind his back, exchanging uncomfortable glances when he walked by. He could hear murmurs of "troublemaker," or "rat" as he passed by them in the hallways, and every now and then, he caught the sharp gaze of a teacher who still seemed skeptical about the whole situation. But Elijah didn't care. He knew he had done the right thing. The most unexpected moment of the entire week came when Mrs. Thompson's sudden absence from school was officially announced over the loudspeaker. Principal Harris had written a letter to the school community, informing everyone that Mrs. Thompson was taking a leave of absence, though no further details were provided. "She's gone," Jamal said with a wide grin. "I guess that's it for her." Elijah tried to suppress a feeling of guilt that crept up his spine. It wasn't as if he was sorry for what had happened, he knew he had to take a stand. But there was something unsettling about the fact that someone had lost their job because of his actions. Even though Mrs. Thompson had been wrong, Elijah couldn't help but wonder if she could ever come back from this. Was there redemption for someone like her? "I don't know, Jamal," Elijah said, shaking his head. "It feels weird. I mean, I'm glad she's not going to be teaching anymore, but I don't know. I keep thinking about what's next for her. Jamal clapped him on the back, his voice firm. Bro, that's not your responsibility. You did what you had to do. What she did was her fault, not yours. You can't fix her. You did the right thing for yourself and for all the kids she hurt. Elijah nodded, trying to believe that was true. In the days following Mrs. Thompson's departure, things at school slowly started to return to normal. Teachers were more cautious around Elijah, no longer giving him that distant, judgmental look they used to. Most of the students avoided discussing what had happened, but there were still whispers when he walked through the halls. It was as if the school had divided itself into two camps, those who supported Elijah and those who didn't. One day, as Elijah was walking to his last class of the day, he felt a tap on his shoulder. Turning around, he saw Emily standing behind him, her face kind and concerned. "Hey, Elijah, can we talk for a second?" she asked softly. "Sure," Elijah replied, his curiosity piqued. He hadn't really talked to Emily much after the whole ordeal with Mrs. Thompson, but he knew she had been one of the few who had supported him from the beginning. They found a quiet spot in the hallway, away from the noise of other students. "I just wanted to tell you that, you're not alone in this. I know a lot of people are giving you a hard time, but there are others who support you, too," Emily said, her voice sincere. Elijah felt a lump form in his throat. It meant so much to him that someone, anyone, was still standing beside him. "Thanks, Emily. I've been feeling kind of off lately, you know. I thought I was doing the right thing, but now I'm just wondering if I messed everything up." Emily gave him a reassuring smile. "You didn't mess anything up, Elijah. You did something that needed to be done. You exposed a problem that wasn't just yours, it was bigger than that. It's not easy, and it's going to be uncomfortable for a while. But people are going to remember what you did. You'll make a difference, even if it doesn't feel like it right now." Elijah smiled, grateful for her words. Maybe it wasn't all in vain. Maybe, just maybe, things could get better. At home that night, Elijah found his father sitting at the kitchen table, working on his laptop. He had barely seen his dad all week, his work schedule had been hectic, and Elijah had been busy dealing with everything at school. "Hey, Dad," Elijah said, leaning against the doorframe. "Got a minute?" Marcus looked up from his laptop and smiled. "Of course, son. What's on your mind?" Elijah hesitated for a moment before sitting down across from him. "I've been thinking about what happened with Mrs. Thompson. It feels like there's a lot of stuff I can't control. People talk, and I can't change that. I'm trying to focus on the good things, but it's hard." Marcus listened carefully, then leaned back in his chair. "I get it. You've been through a lot. But what you need to understand is that it's not your job to fix everything. You stood up for what was right, and that's something that takes courage. But sometimes, doing the right thing means dealing with fallout. It's messy. It's uncomfortable. And it's not always fair." Elijah nodded, absorbing his father's words. "I get that. But I still feel like I'm not done, you know. Like, there's more that needs to change. Mrs. Thompson might be gone, but I don't think that fixes everything." Marcus smiled knowingly. "That's the thing about change, it's a ripple effect. One person standing up makes waves. It won't fix everything all at once, but it's a start. What you did, it matters." Elijah's chest swelled with emotion. He was right. It wasn't just about taking down Mrs. Thompson. It was about something bigger. A message. A movement. Elijah realized that he had sparked something. Maybe, just maybe, things could change for the better. The next day at school, Elijah noticed a new flyer posted on the bulletin board. It was a call for students to join a discussion group on school fairness and creating a more respectful environment for everyone. It was a small step, but it felt like a victory. As he stared at the flyer, he felt a sense of determination settle over him. He wasn't done yet. This was just the beginning. The next week, the air at school felt charged with an unusual energy. The whispers were still there, but there was something else in the mix now, something stronger, more hopeful. Elijah could sense it every time he walked into a classroom or sat in the cafeteria. The students were beginning to have conversations they had never had before. Conversations about fairness, respect, and what it really meant to stand up for one another. It wasn't easy. There were still a few students who thought Elijah was a troublemaker, and a handful of teachers who still seemed skeptical about his actions. But more and more, Elijah noticed something shifting. Teachers had started to encourage open dialogue in class. Students, who had once kept their heads down, now spoke up more freely when they noticed something unfair or unjust happening. It was like a spark had been lit, and no one could quite put it out. One afternoon, as Elijah was walking down the hallway, he spotted Jamal coming toward him with a determined look on his face. "Hey, man, got a second?" Jamal asked, his voice full of excitement. "Yeah, what's up?" Elijah replied, stopping to wait for Jamal to catch up. Jamal grinned. "I heard about that meeting the school's setting up. The one about fairness and making the school better. I think you should go. You know, take the next step. I don't know if you noticed, but people are talking about how we all need to stick together, especially now." Elijah raised an eyebrow. "Yeah, I saw the flyer. But, I don't know, Jamal. I mean, it's one thing to stand up and call out Mrs. Thompson, but what if I'm in over my head now? What if this whole thing becomes more than I can handle?" Jamal placed a hand on Elijah's shoulder, giving him a confident look. "Man, you've already handled more than most people ever will. You've got a real shot at changing things here. Not just for you, but for everyone. Besides, you're not alone in this." Elijah thought about Jamal's words for a moment. He had been unsure of what was next, but hearing his friend's encouragement gave him a boost of confidence. Jamal was right. He hadn't done this alone. There had been countless people along the way who had supported him, whether it was his family, his friends, or the other students who believed in him. Maybe it was time to take the next step. The meeting was set for after school, and Elijah showed up feeling a bit nervous. As he entered the school's library, he saw a small group of students gathered around a table. Some faces he recognized, others, not so much. The group was a mix of different grades, backgrounds, and experiences. But the one thing they all had in common was that they were ready for change. The group was led by Ms. Rivers, a history teacher who had always been an advocate for equality and fairness. She stood at the front of the room, her presence calm but commanding. "Thanks for coming, everyone," she said, smiling warmly. "We're here today because we believe in making our school a place where everyone feels respected and heard. This isn't just about one incident, it's about creating a culture of kindness, support, and fairness for everyone." Elijah took a seat toward the back, listening intently. He was still a bit hesitant, unsure of how he could contribute. But as the discussion went on, he found his voice. Students shared their experiences, times when they had been treated unfairly, overlooked, or dismissed. Each story, no matter how big or small, contributed to a larger picture of the problems within the school. "I've been through a lot of stuff," one girl named Rachel said, speaking up from the front of the room. "I've seen teachers turn a blind eye to bullying, to kids who are treated like they don't matter just because they're different. And no one ever stands up. Not until now." Another student, a sophomore named Ben, added, "Yeah, and it's not just about students either. We need teachers who will listen to us and stand with us when things aren't right. We shouldn't have to fight this battle alone." Elijah's heart swelled as he listened. This was the conversation he had been waiting for. This was what he had hoped would happen after Mrs. Thompson's departure, people coming together, not just to talk about the problem, but to actively work toward a solution. When it was his turn to speak, Elijah felt a lump form in his throat, but he pushed through. I think we all know that what happened with Mrs. Thompson isn't an isolated incident. It's part of a bigger problem. I didn't want to stand up in the beginning. I didn't want to make waves. But sometimes, you have to. I don't know exactly what the solution is yet, but I do know that we all have to start by speaking up. By being brave enough to say when something isn't right. There was a quiet moment in the room after Elijah spoke. He could see the impact of his words. Students who had been sitting quietly now nodded, their eyes wide with understanding. Ms. Rivers stepped forward, her expression thoughtful. Elijah's right. Change doesn't happen in silence. It happens when we stand up, even when it's difficult. So, let's make a plan. How can we create a school environment where no one feels invisible? How can we make sure that everyone, staff, students, everyone, feels like they matter? The group went on to brainstorm ideas, and Elijah felt a sense of purpose he hadn't felt before. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about making sure that no one else had to go through what he did. It was about building something that would last. That evening, Elijah sat at the kitchen table with his parents, telling them about the meeting and everything that had been discussed. His mother's eyes lit up with pride. "You're really doing something here, Elijah. I can see that. You're helping change the conversation." Elijah shrugged, still a little overwhelmed. "It's just the beginning, Mom. But I feel like we can make a difference. Like we've got a shot at changing things for good." Marcus leaned back in his chair, his smile warm but serious. "I'm proud of you, son. But remember, change doesn't happen overnight. It's going to take time. You've got to be patient and persistent." Elijah nodded. "I know, Dad. But I'm ready. I'm not backing down. We're just getting started." As the days passed, Elijah found himself more and more involved in the discussions and activities surrounding the school's push for a better environment. There were meetings, projects, and a growing sense of unity among the students. It wasn't perfect, and there were still struggles along the way. But Elijah knew that every small action, every conversation, every time someone stood up for what was right, it was making a difference. He was starting to understand something important. Change wasn't just about standing up against one person. It was about standing up for everyone. And in that moment, Elijah felt more certain than ever that he was exactly where he was meant to be. The momentum at school continued to grow. Elijah had never imagined that standing up for what was right could bring about such a change, not just for him but for the entire school community. But as the days went by, he began to realize that this was about more than just one incident. It was about breaking down barriers, challenging old mindsets, and creating an environment where everyone felt valued, regardless of their background. In the weeks following the meeting, the school had transformed. The discussion group, which had started small, now had dozens of students involved, representing different grades, different social circles, and even different cliques. For the first time in a long time, students were coming together, working towards something bigger than their differences. Elijah was becoming more of a leader in these conversations, though he hadn't expected it. At first, he had just wanted to be a part of the change, to support others who had suffered like he had. But now, his voice was one of the loudest in the room. He was the one who could stand up and speak honestly about the issues, about the pain of feeling invisible and dismissed, and about the hope that things could be better. One day, during lunch, Elijah and Jamal were sitting at a table with a few other friends when one of the seniors, Ryan, approached them. Ryan was the captain of the football team, and up until recently, had been one of the students who never paid much attention to Elijah. He was the kind of guy who fit in with the popular crowd, often keeping his distance from students who were perceived as different. But things were changing. "Hey, Elijah. Got a minute?" Ryan said, his tone surprisingly casual. Elijah looked up, slightly taken aback. Yeah, sure. What's up?" Ryan looked around, making sure no one was listening, then sat down across from Elijah. "Listen, I've been hearing a lot about what you've been doing. And, well, I just wanted to say, I think it's cool. You've got guts, man. What you did with Mrs. Thompson, standing up like that, it got people talking. Got me thinking about some things." Elijah blinked, not sure how to respond. Ryan was a jock, the kind of guy who had always seemed too busy to care about social issues. Thanks, Ryan. I didn't really do it for the attention or anything. I just did what I thought was right." Ryan nodded, his gaze sincere. "I get that. I think you've helped open a lot of eyes around here. And, well, I've been talking to some of the guys on the team, and we're thinking we need to do something about this too. Not just the stuff that happened with Mrs. Thompson, but the way people get treated here, you know. It's not right." Elijah felt his heart race a little, surprised by Ryan's words. "Wait, are you serious? You're gonna talk about this stuff with the team?" Ryan shrugged. "Yeah. We need to. People need to see that this isn't just some us versus them thing. It's not about the jocks versus the rest of the school. It's about all of us together. We're all part of this school, and we should be treating each other like it." Elijah smiled, feeling a weight lift off his shoulders. This wasn't the kind of conversation he had ever expected to have with someone like Ryan. But that was the power of what had started. A movement, no matter how small, had the ability to bring people together, people who might have never seen eye to eye before. "I didn't think I'd ever hear that from you," Elijah said, laughing lightly. "But hey, if you're serious, I'm in. Let me know what you need me to do." Ryan gave him a nod of approval. "We're planning to do some kind of awareness event, maybe next week. We'll get the word out, and everyone's gonna know that this stuff matters. It's time for a change." That afternoon, Elijah couldn't help but feel the weight of the moment. For the first time, it felt like the whole school was starting to shift. What had started as a personal battle had become a collective effort, a fight for respect, for kindness, and for fairness. The very next day, word spread about the upcoming awareness event. Posters were put up around the school, detailing the date, time, and theme of the event. It was called One Voice, One School, and it was a call to everyone, students, teachers, staff, to come together and show that they stood for a positive and inclusive environment. The event would feature speeches, discussions, and even performances, all focusing on unity, diversity, and respect. Elijah could hardly believe how fast everything had taken off. The event wasn't just a small gathering, it was quickly becoming the most talked about thing in school. In the days leading up to the event, Elijah noticed something else, something that filled him with both excitement and dread. Mrs. Thompson's absence had remained a topic of conversation, but it wasn't just about her anymore. It had evolved into something bigger. Students who had once felt silenced were now speaking out about their experiences, and teachers who had turned a blind eye to injustice were beginning to confront their own biases. The school was, slowly but surely, becoming a place where people felt safe to express their opinions and demand change. But the road to change wasn't always smooth. A few days before the event, Elijah overheard a conversation between two teachers in the hallway. He didn't mean to eavesdrop, but their words were unmistakable. "I don't think this event is going to do anything," one teacher said. "This is just a bunch of kids playing activist for a day. It won't make any difference in the long run." Elijah's stomach turned. It wasn't the first time he'd heard someone dismiss the movement, but it still stung. He had hoped the teachers would be more supportive, more willing to embrace the idea of creating real change. But some still clung to their old ways, unwilling to see the world from a different perspective. The day of the event arrived, and the energy in the school was electric. The gymnasium was filled with students, teachers, and staff, all gathered to take part in the event. Elijah felt a mix of nervousness and excitement as he stood at the front of the room, waiting for the speeches to begin. The first speaker was Ryan, who spoke passionately about how everyone had a role to play in making the school a better place. "We can't just expect things to change if we don't make an effort to change them ourselves," he said. "We need to stand up, not just when it's easy, but when it's hard. We need to make sure that everyone in this school feels like they belong." The room erupted in applause. One by one, other students and teachers took the stage, sharing their thoughts and experiences. Some of the stories were heartbreaking, others were uplifting, but all of them conveyed the same message: change was possible. But it required action. It required all of them, students, teachers, and staff, to work together. When it was Elijah's turn to speak, he took a deep breath, his heart pounding in his chest. He wasn't just speaking for himself anymore, he was speaking for everyone who had ever felt invisible or ignored. "I didn't start this movement for attention," he said, his voice steady. "I started it because I was tired of seeing people treated like they don't matter. I'm here today because I believe that no one should have to fight alone. We're all in this together, and together, we can make this school a place where everyone feels seen, heard, and valued." The room fell silent, and for a moment, Elijah felt as if the weight of the world was on his shoulders. But then the applause began. And it didn't stop. The entire gymnasium rose to its feet, clapping and cheering, their faces filled with hope and determination. The event had been a success, but Elijah knew this was just the beginning. The real work was only starting, and it would take time, effort, and courage. But for the first time, he felt confident that change was within reach. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough? The following weeks were a whirlwind. The success of the One Voice, One School event had given Elijah and his friends an overwhelming sense of accomplishment, but it also made them realize just how much work was left to be done. The event had brought a lot of attention to the issues at school, and though the atmosphere was certainly more inclusive and open, there were still pockets of resistance. The people who had dismissed the movement, who had avoided confronting their own biases, were still there. And now, their voices were growing louder. Elijah often found himself walking through the halls, his head held a little higher, but with a constant sense of vigilance. He couldn't afford to let his guard down now. It had taken courage to stand up for what was right, but the path ahead was far from smooth. Every step forward felt like 2 steps forward, and 1 step back. One morning, as Elijah was heading to class, he noticed a group of students gathered by the lockers, talking in hushed tones. As he passed by, he caught a few words. "Just a phase, man. This whole equality thing won't last. They'll get tired of it." He stopped in his tracks, recognizing the voice. It was Kyle, a student who had always been indifferent toward the movement, often seen in the background making sarcastic remarks whenever the topic came up. Elijah turned back around, walking toward the group. He wasn't sure if he was ready for this conversation, but he couldn't let this moment slip by. "Hey, Kyle," Elijah called out, his voice calm but firm. Kyle turned, a smirk forming on his face. "What's up, Elijah? You here to remind me about how we're all supposed to be equal and respectful, or whatever? Man, you really think people care about all this?" Elijah took a deep breath. "You might not think people care, but the truth is, they do. And people like me are tired of being treated like we don't matter. You've heard the stories. You know what's been happening. It's not just a phase for us, it's real." Kyle scoffed. "Oh, please. I'm sure it's all dramatic and emotional, but it doesn't change anything. People are always gonna be different. Why try to fix something that can't be fixed?" Elijah could feel the anger bubbling up inside him, but he pushed it down. He didn't need to get into a shouting match with Kyle. It's not about fixing things. It's about treating people with dignity. It's about making sure that no one, regardless of their race or background, has to feel like they don't belong. Kyle shrugged, as if the conversation wasn't worth his time. "Yeah, whatever, man. Good luck with all that." He turned to walk away, leaving Elijah standing there, his mind racing. Elijah felt frustrated, like a weight was pressing down on his chest. How could someone like Kyle, who had been at the school for years, still think that way? How could he dismiss something so important as if it were just a fleeting trend? But Elijah knew he couldn't let it bother him. He had bigger things to focus on. He was doing something that mattered, and no matter how many people didn't understand, he couldn't stop now. Later that day, Elijah met up with Jamal in the library. Jamal had noticed Elijah's tense expression as he walked in and immediately asked, "What happened, man?" Elijah slumped down into a chair, rubbing his temples. "It's Kyle. He's still acting like this whole thing is some phase. Like none of it's real. I don't know what to do. People like him, they just don't get it." Jamal sat down across from him, his face serious. "You can't change everyone's mind overnight, Elijah. Some people are just stuck in their ways, and they won't see what's wrong until they're ready to open their eyes. But that doesn't mean you should stop what you're doing. The fact that you're out here pushing for something better, people are paying attention, even if they won't admit it." Elijah nodded, trying to absorb Jamal's words. It was hard not to let the negativity affect him. He had poured his heart into this cause, and to be met with resistance, it stung. But he also knew Jamal was right. Change wasn't easy, and it would take time. "I guess you're right," Elijah said after a long pause. "But it's hard not to feel like we're fighting an uphill battle. Sometimes I wonder if we'll ever get everyone on board." Jamal leaned back in his chair, thinking for a moment. "You don't need everyone on board, man. You just need the right people. And you've already got them. Look at all the people who showed up at the event. Look at how much has changed already. Even the people who don't want to change, they're noticing. That's half the battle." Elijah took a deep breath, his frustration slowly melting away. Jamal was right. They weren't going to win over every person in the school. But the people who mattered, the ones who were willing to make a difference, they were already on his side. The following week, Elijah found himself standing before a classroom full of students. It was his turn to give a presentation for the class project about equality and fairness in school. His nerves had been there at first, but as he looked at the faces around him, he felt a renewed sense of confidence. He had already started this journey. This was just another step forward. "I'm not here to tell you that everything is perfect or that we've solved all our problems," Elijah began, his voice steady. "But I am here to tell you that change is possible. It's not going to be easy, and it's not going to happen overnight. But we all have a role to play. We all have the power to make a difference, no matter how small." As he spoke, Elijah saw nods from his classmates. He could tell they were listening. This wasn't just some speech, it was real, it was personal, and it mattered. "I used to think that things couldn't change," Elijah continued. "I thought that maybe it was just the way things were. But I learned that if we want to see change, we have to create it ourselves. We have to be the ones to step up and say, this isn't right. And we have to keep pushing, even when it's hard." By the end of the presentation, Elijah felt a surge of pride. The students in the class were clapping, and even the teacher, who had initially been skeptical of the movement, looked impressed. That night, as Elijah walked home from school, he felt a weight lift off his shoulders. For the first time in a while, he wasn't just focused on the battles ahead. He was focused on the progress they had made. Sure, there were still people who didn't understand, but that didn't matter. What mattered was that they had started something. They had started a conversation that couldn't be ignored. As the weeks passed, Elijah's efforts to bring awareness and unity to his school continued to grow. But not everyone was pleased with the shift in atmosphere. Mrs. Thompson, the teacher who had caused so much tension, was still out on medical leave, but Elijah could feel the tension in the air whenever the subject came up. People were still talking about what happened, what Mrs. Thompson had done, and what had come of it. Her absence was a constant reminder that the fight wasn't over, and for many, the whole thing still felt unfinished. Then, one day, as Elijah walked into his history class, the substitute teacher greeted him with a nod. "Morning, Elijah. Looks like we're starting a new chapter today. Mrs. Thompson will be back next week." Elijah's stomach sank. The mention of her name always stirred up a mixture of frustration and uncertainty. How could things possibly go back to normal after everything that had happened? Would she be the same person who had stolen his lunch day after day, and more importantly, would she be the same person who had dismissed his feelings when he finally spoke up? The entire class seemed tense as they shuffled to their seats. No one spoke, but Elijah could sense the unspoken questions in the air. What would happen when Mrs. Thompson returned? Would the school go back to ignoring the deeper issues? Would their efforts to create change be in vain? As the lesson began, the door opened, and Mrs. Thompson walked in. She was back. Elijah's heart skipped a beat as she stood at the front of the room, adjusting her glasses and smoothing out the creases in her cardigan. She looked exactly as she had before, but somehow different. The absence had softened her presence, and for a moment, Elijah wondered if the time away had allowed her to reflect on her actions. "Good morning, everyone," she said, her voice steady, but there was something in her tone that suggested she was aware of the shift that had taken place in the school. "I'm sure you're all wondering what happened while I was gone. Well, I've had some time to think." Elijah felt his pulse quicken. Could this be it? Could Mrs. Thompson finally be willing to address what she had done? The class fell silent as Mrs. Thompson cleared her throat, her eyes moving over the students with a mixture of hesitation and resolve. "I know that things have been difficult in my absence. I know I've made some mistakes, and I want to acknowledge them. First and foremost, I want to say that I'm sorry for what happened with Elijah. I didn't treat him with the respect he deserved, and for that, I'm truly sorry." Elijah sat frozen in his seat, his mind racing. This was more than he had ever expected. Mrs. Thompson was admitting fault. She was acknowledging what she had done, something that had never happened before. "I understand that my actions were harmful, not just to Elijah but to the whole school community," she continued. "I've had time to reflect, and I want to be better. I want to help create a space where everyone feels safe and valued." Elijah's mind was reeling. For so long, he had only dreamed of this moment, the moment when the person who had wronged him would finally see the truth. But now that it was happening, it didn't feel as simple as he had imagined. For the next several days, Mrs. Thompson's apology weighed heavily on him. He couldn't quite bring himself to forgive her completely, not yet, at least. Forgiveness, he knew, would take time. But what she had done was a start. She was trying to change, and that was something Elijah hadn't expected. It was a Friday afternoon when he saw her again, after school, in the hallway. She was standing by the door to the teacher's lounge, looking almost lost as she watched the students walk past. Elijah hesitated for a moment, but something inside him pushed him forward. He had to say something. "Mrs. Thompson," he called softly, his voice uncertain. She turned, surprised to see him. "Elijah," she said with a small smile. "I didn't expect to see you here." He nodded, a little nervous but determined. "I've been thinking a lot about what you said in class the other day." Mrs. Thompson shifted her weight, glancing around the hallway as if she were afraid someone might overhear. "I hope I didn't make you uncomfortable with my apology. I just want you to know that I'm trying to change. It's not going to happen overnight, but I'm committed to doing better." Elijah took a deep breath, feeling the weight of the conversation pressing down on him. "I don't know if I'm ready to forgive you yet," he said honestly. "But I appreciate that you're trying. I think it's going to take time for me to trust that things will actually change. But, if you're really serious about it, I think we can work together to make this school better. We can help people understand." Mrs. Thompson's eyes softened as she nodded. I understand. I don't expect you to forgive me right away. But I promise you, I'll do whatever I can to prove that I'm trying to make a difference. I want to be part of that change, Elijah. For a brief moment, the two of them stood there, looking at each other, not as teacher and student, but as people who had both made mistakes and were now trying to heal. The next few weeks were full of small steps. Mrs. Thompson became more involved in the conversations surrounding diversity and inclusion at the school. She attended meetings, listened to student stories, and even participated in a few of the awareness events Elijah had helped organize. It wasn't perfect, and there were still moments of tension, but there was progress. There was change. For Elijah, this was a turning point. His feelings were still mixed, he wasn't ready to forget everything that had happened, but he also knew that this wasn't just about one person or one moment. It was about creating a better, more supportive environment for everyone. One day, after a meeting with the school administrators, Elijah sat down with Jamal in the cafeteria. The atmosphere had changed in ways they hadn't expected, and they could both feel it. "So," Jamal said, taking a bite of his sandwich, "how do you feel about everything with Mrs. Thompson? Do you think she's actually changing?" Elijah thought for a moment, feeling a strange mix of emotions. "I think she's trying. And that's more than I expected. I still don't know if I'll ever trust her completely, but I can see that she's putting in the effort. And that's what matters, right? People who are willing to change." Jamal nodded, a smile tugging at his lips. "Yeah, man. People don't change overnight, but they do change. And sometimes, that's enough." That afternoon, as Elijah walked home, he realized something important. This battle, this journey, wasn't just about confronting the wrongs of the past. It was about creating a future where everyone had a voice. It was about making sure that no one had to suffer in silence, and that those who had made mistakes could find the courage to admit them and move forward. As the weeks passed, Elijah continued to feel the weight of everything around him. The school was evolving, yes, but not without its bumps. Mrs. Thompson's apology had been a breakthrough, but that didn't mean she was suddenly everyone's best friend. There were still murmurs in the halls, students who whispered behind his back, teachers who acted like the whole incident never happened. It was easy for some to pretend it hadn't been a big deal, as if the situation had been resolved just because a teacher had apologized. But Elijah wasn't fooled. He knew that real change wasn't something that could be solved in a single conversation or apology. Real change took time, effort, and most importantly, courage to keep pushing when it would have been easier to stay silent. It was during one of his routine meetings with Jamal in the school library that something unexpected happened. Elijah was sitting at a table, reviewing notes for an upcoming presentation on the school's diversity efforts, when Jamal walked in with someone Elijah hadn't seen before, Marcus, the football team captain. Marcus had always been a presence in the school, but he wasn't the type to associate with Elijah. He was one of the popular students, the kind who never seemed to think much about issues like race or inequality. He was always surrounded by his teammates, and they were often caught up in the sports culture of the school, focused solely on winning games, getting attention, and keeping their social status intact. But here he was, standing in the library with Jamal. "Yo, Elijah, this is Marcus," Jamal said, a grin spreading across his face. "We've been talking about the whole one voice, one school thing, and he wants to help out." Elijah looked up, stunned. "Wait, what? Marcus?" Marcus smiled nervously, his usual confidence softened by the unfamiliar setting. "Yeah, man. I know I haven't exactly been the most vocal about all this, but I've been thinking a lot about what you've been doing. It's not just about you anymore, it's about all of us. I want to help." Elijah blinked, unsure of how to react. He'd seen Marcus around school, but the idea of him actually wanting to get involved in the movement was baffling. He had always been a part of the status quo, someone who never seemed to care about what was going on in the community around him. "You want to help?" Elijah asked slowly. "What changed?" Marcus shrugged, glancing at Jamal for a moment before turning his attention back to Elijah. "Honestly, I just realized that the stuff you're doing, it's important. And I haven't been paying attention to it. I've been so focused on football and being popular that I never even thought about the fact that people are hurting, people like you. People who aren't treated the same." Jamal gave a knowing nod, clearly proud of his friend's newfound perspective. "It wasn't just me, man. You heard about the event, you saw the support. It's about all of us." Elijah sat back in his chair, feeling a sense of disbelief mixed with cautious hope. A part of him wanted to believe Marcus, but another part was skeptical. He had seen so many people say they wanted to help in the past, only to fall short when things got tough. But something in Marcus's eyes told him this wasn't just some fleeting moment of sympathy. There was genuine interest there. "So, what do you want to do?" Elijah asked, his voice steady but filled with uncertainty. Marcus seemed to think for a moment before answering. "I think we should start with the athletes. We've got a huge influence over the student body, and if we're willing to speak up, maybe others will listen. I'm not saying we can fix everything, but we can start by leading by example." Jamal's eyes lit up. "Exactly. We can work together to show that it's not about the popular crowd or the jocks, it's about everyone. We can all play a role in this." Elijah was quiet for a moment, letting the idea sink in. He hadn't expected this. Marcus, a football player, someone whose world was so different from his, wanting to help lead the charge for equality in unity. But maybe that was the point. Maybe real change didn't always come from where you expected. Maybe it came from the most unexpected places. "All right, I'm in," Elijah said finally, a small smile forming on his face. "Let's see where this goes." The following week, Marcus kept his word. He helped organize a meeting with the football team, and Elijah was invited to speak to the players about the importance of inclusivity and standing up against racism. At first, the players were skeptical. Many of them had grown up in a culture where competitiveness often overshadowed the values of empathy and unity. But as Elijah spoke, telling stories of what it felt like to be overlooked, ignored, and excluded, something shifted. There was a quiet sense of realization among the team. Marcus, sitting at the front, made eye contact with Elijah, silently encouraging him. Every now and then, he'd look at his teammates, urging them to listen. By the end of the meeting, a few of the players had raised their hands, offering their support. "I never really thought about how it affects people," one of the players, Tyler, admitted. "I just always figured it was just the way things are. But now that you put it like that, I get it. I think I could do more." Another player, Chris, nodded. "Yeah, man. Same. We can't just sit by and let this stuff happen anymore. We gotta be better." By the time the meeting ended, the football team had decided to join the movement. They agreed to wear armbands at the next game to show their support for equality. It wasn't a huge gesture, but it was something. And for Elijah, it was a sign of hope. Change was happening, slowly, but surely. He was starting to see that the fight for equality wasn't just his alone. It was a fight that everyone could be part of, no matter their background or social group. But not everyone was on board. As expected, there were still some who saw the movement as a passing trend, something that would fade once the buzz wore off. But with the support of the football team and a growing number of students, Elijah felt like they were building something bigger than they could have imagined. The next day, Elijah received a text from Jamal that made his heart skip a beat. "Marcus just texted me, he's gonna wear that armband at the game tonight. But he also wants to start a school-wide movement. Something bigger. He says it's time we make a real impact." Elijah couldn't help but grin. Maybe this was it. Maybe this was the spark they needed to take the movement to the next level. As he headed to the game later that evening, he felt a surge of optimism. For the first time in a long while, Elijah truly believed that change was coming. And maybe, just maybe, it was happening because people were finally ready to listen. The atmosphere at the football game that night was electric. The stands were packed with cheering students, their excitement filling the air as the home team prepared to face off against their rivals. But for Elijah, the usual thrill of a high school football game was different this time. He wasn't there just to watch the game unfold, he was there to witness something much bigger than a simple match on the field. As he entered the stadium, he noticed something unexpected. The football players, usually dressed in their jerseys with their names proudly displayed on the back, were wearing armbands, bright blue bands that stood out in the sea of school colors. They weren't just part of their uniforms anymore, they were a statement. And each one of those armbands bore a single word: equality. Marcus had kept his word. He had rallied the entire football team to support the movement, and now, the team was stepping out in solidarity with Elijah and everyone who had fought for a school free from discrimination. As the players stood in a huddle before the game began, Elijah spotted Marcus standing tall in the center, his eyes meeting Elijah's across the field. Jamal was right beside Elijah, giving him a nudge. "This is big, man. This is what we've been talking about. The football team is setting the tone." Elijah could hardly believe it. The same group of students who had once been unaware of the struggles Elijah and others like him faced were now standing up to make a difference. It felt like the whole school was about to witness a moment of real change. The game started with the usual intensity, the players giving it their all on the field. But something felt different this time. Every time the camera zoomed in on a player making a great play, Elijah couldn't help but notice the armbands, the small but powerful gesture that spoke volumes. It was a quiet act of defiance against the status quo. Throughout the game, the armbands caught the attention of the crowd. Students were pointing and whispering to each other, trying to understand the significance. It wasn't long before a few other teams, especially the cheerleaders, followed suit and donned their own armbands. Soon, the bleachers were filled with a sea of blue, each person wearing the band as a symbol of their commitment to equality. As halftime approached, Elijah felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to see Mrs. Thompson walking toward him, her face serious but calm. "Elijah, I just wanted to say something," she began, her voice low to avoid the noise of the crowd around them. "I don't know if you've noticed, but the entire student body is talking about the armbands. The football team, the cheerleaders, everyone. It's making an impact. You've got their attention. I'm proud of you." Elijah raised an eyebrow, surprised by her words. "You are?" Mrs. Thompson nodded, her expression sincere. "Yes. I see what you've been working toward. I've seen the change in the way the students are acting, the way they're looking at each other. I didn't think this would happen, but I can see now that I was wrong. I may not have been a part of this at first, but I want to help now. I want to keep moving forward with this." Elijah paused, considering her words. It wasn't the first time she had shown signs of remorse, but hearing her admit that she was willing to take an active role in the movement gave him a sense of cautious optimism. The road to true change was long and difficult, but maybe they could build something better together. He smiled faintly. "Thank you, Mrs. Thompson. I mean it. It's not about fixing everything overnight, but this is a start." She gave him a nod, and for the first time in a long while, Elijah felt like he wasn't facing this fight alone. Maybe they weren't done yet, but the change he had worked for was finally beginning to take shape in ways he hadn't even expected. As the game resumed, Elijah found himself unable to tear his eyes away from the field. The energy in the stadium had shifted, and it wasn't just because of the game. It was because the students were standing up for something bigger than school spirit. They were standing up for equality, for respect, for change. The final whistle blew, and the game ended in a close win for their school. But it wasn't the score that stayed with Elijah, it was the look on everyone's faces as they left the stadium. The armbands, the conversations, the unity, it was a message that echoed throughout the school. The next morning, Elijah woke up to an unexpected flood of messages. His phone buzzed continuously as students from different grades reached out to share their thoughts. Some were inspired by the football team's gesture and wanted to get involved. Others expressed their support for the movement, asking how they could contribute. A few even shared their own stories of discrimination, opening up about experiences they had kept silent for far too long. One message stood out among the rest. It was from Marcus. "Yo Elijah, man, I think we really did something last night. People are talking. We've got more supporters than I thought. Let's talk soon. We've got a lot more work to do." Elijah smiled, his heart swelling with pride. He knew that the road ahead wouldn't be easy. There were still plenty of obstacles to overcome, still so many battles to fight. But the moment he had been waiting for was here. The movement was gaining momentum, and the whole school was beginning to listen. The following week, a special assembly was called in the auditorium. The entire student body gathered, curious to know what would come next. As they settled into their seats, Elijah stood at the front of the room, flanked by Marcus and Jamal. The air was thick with anticipation. The principal stepped up to the podium and cleared his throat. "Good morning, everyone. I want to take a moment to acknowledge something important. Over the past few weeks, we've seen a movement take root at this school. A movement about unity, respect, and equality. It's not just about what happens in the classroom or on the football field, it's about all of us, coming together to build a better, more inclusive community." The principal's words were followed by a wave of applause, the sound reverberating through the auditorium. Elijah could see students exchanging looks, nodding in agreement, and for the first time, he truly believed that they were ready to make a difference. As the assembly continued, Elijah, Marcus, and Jamal spoke to the student body about their goals and the future of the movement. It was a call to action, a rallying cry for everyone to join forces and keep pushing for change. The road ahead wasn't going to be easy, but they were no longer facing it alone. As Elijah stepped off the stage, he exchanged a look with Marcus, who grinned back at him. "We've got a long way to go, but this is just the beginning. Let's keep it going." Elijah nodded, his heart full of hope. "Yeah. This is just the beginning." The journey to change had begun, and it was clear that this was only the first step. But with allies like Marcus, Jamal, and even Mrs. Thompson, Elijah felt ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. Together, they could make a difference. Together, they could change the world. The days that followed the assembly were filled with energy and optimism. The air was thick with anticipation as students across the school began to feel the ripple effect of the movement. There was a noticeable shift on campus. Conversations that once would have been avoided or brushed under the rug now became the center of attention, discussions about equality, race, and the importance of standing up for what's right. It felt like something was changing deep within the core of the school. Elijah, Marcus, and Jamal worked tirelessly to keep the momentum going. Their mission wasn't just about one event or one act of solidarity, it was about creating a culture of respect that would permeate the entire school. It was during one of their lunchtime meetings in the library that things took a turn. They were brainstorming ideas for their next step when they heard a knock on the door. To their surprise, it was a group of students from different cliques, students who were usually known for their social divides. The cheerleaders, a few kids from the drama club, and some athletes other than the football team had come to join the conversation. "I know we don't usually hang out in the same circles," said Emily, a cheerleader who had recently started wearing the armband in support of the movement. "But we've been talking, and we think it's time we start making some bigger moves. If we're really going to change the culture here, we need everyone." Elijah looked up, surprised by the turnout. He had expected to see the usual faces, people who had already been part of the movement from the start. But this was different. This was the first time that people from different social groups were coming together to take action. "I think you're right," Elijah replied, standing up to face the group. "This can't just be a movement for some of us. It has to be for all of us." Jamal nodded in agreement. "We've got the momentum now. It's about finding ways to spread the message, to keep this thing alive in every corner of the school. The group gathered around the table, tossing out ideas. They brainstormed ways to host school-wide events, from rallies to fundraisers for causes that supported racial equality. They talked about having open forums where students could share their stories and experiences, a safe space where everyone could come together and learn from each other. The possibilities seemed endless. But amidst all the excitement, there was also a sense of hesitation. They all knew the reality, not everyone in the school was on board. There were still those who preferred to keep things the way they had always been, those who were resistant to change. And then there were the teachers. Although Mrs. Thompson had taken a stand, Elijah knew that not all faculty members shared her enthusiasm. Some were still indifferent or uncomfortable with the new direction the school was taking. There was work to be done, not just among students, but among the adults in the building as well. The next day, the school was abuzz with rumors of a new event, Unity Day, planned for the following month. The students were talking excitedly about the event, which would include performances, art displays, and discussions on race and inclusivity. For the first time, Elijah felt like something truly special was being created. As they finalized the details for the event, Elijah couldn't help but notice the small, yet significant, shifts happening around him. He had been working so hard to build a movement, but now, it felt like the movement was building itself. People from all walks of life were stepping forward, claiming their part in this fight for equality. The football team's support continued to inspire others. Every time the players took the field, the armbands remained, a visible sign of their commitment. But as more students got involved, there was an undeniable sense that the movement had moved beyond the football team or any single group. It had become a school-wide initiative, a unified effort to make the environment more inclusive. Elijah's heart swelled with pride as he walked down the hallway one morning and saw students of all kinds wearing the blue armbands, students from different social circles, ethnic backgrounds, and even some teachers. The once quiet act of defiance had blossomed into something that couldn't be ignored. But not everyone was on board. During lunch one day, a group of students who hadn't been involved in the movement approached Elijah. They were from a different crowd, students who had often stood on the sidelines, observing but not engaging in the conversations about race and equality. They were the ones who had remained silent, the ones who had stayed quiet when things got tough. But today was different. They came to Elijah with a question. "We don't get it," said Jake, a senior who had always been part of the in crowd at school. "I mean, we see the armbands, and we see what's going on, but why does this matter so much? Why does it need to be a big deal?" Elijah paused, taken aback by the bluntness of the question. It wasn't the first time someone had asked him that, but it still stung. "This isn't just a big deal for the sake of making noise," Elijah said calmly, gathering his thoughts. "This is about making sure that every student, regardless of who they are, feels like they belong. It's about making sure that no one has to feel like they're less than someone else, simply because of the color of their skin." Jake looked uncertain, glancing around at his friends. They seemed unsure, too, as if they had never really thought about it this way. "You don't have to be a part of the movement to understand that people deserve to be treated with respect," Elijah continued. "It's not about taking sides. It's about standing up for what's right." For a moment, the group was silent. Then Jake spoke up again. "We don't want to just sit back anymore. We get it. We'll wear the armbands, too." Elijah was shocked, but he could see the sincerity in their eyes. It wasn't much, but it was a sign that change was happening, not just among those who had already been vocal, but even among those who had previously been indifferent. As the days went on, Elijah saw more and more students coming forward, joining in, not just out of obligation but because they believed in the cause. The school was finally beginning to look like the community Elijah had always hoped for, a place where everyone had a voice, where respect was the foundation, and where unity was the goal. The final preparations for Unity Day were in full swing. It was shaping up to be the biggest event the school had ever seen. Students from all grades, backgrounds, and groups were working together to make it a success. There were dances, art exhibits, poetry readings, and speakers lined up, all designed to bring the community closer together and start conversations that mattered. But as the event neared, Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't just about Unity Day. It was about the future of the school, and what would happen after that day. The real work was just beginning. Unity Day was finally here. The school had never seen anything like it. The hallways were lined with posters promoting the event, showcasing messages of unity, equality, and hope. The smell of freshly baked goods from the bake sale filled the air as students hustled between booths, chatting and laughing. There was a feeling of togetherness that hadn't been there before, a sense that everyone, no matter their background or social group, was a part of something bigger. Elijah walked through the crowd with Marcus and Jamal, feeling the weight of what this day represented. This wasn't just another school event. This was the culmination of everything they had fought for, the conversations they'd started, the armbands that had become symbols of solidarity, the rallies, the assemblies. This was their moment, and Elijah could feel the energy in the air as if the whole school was holding its breath in anticipation. "Look at this, man," Jamal said, his voice filled with awe. "We really did it. This is more than I ever thought possible." Elijah couldn't help but agree. It felt surreal to see so many people, from all different walks of life, coming together in one place for a common purpose. The art exhibits in the hallways showcased the stories of students from every background, paintings, photographs, and sculptures depicting their experiences with race, identity, and unity. There were performances, dances, and even a spoken word segment where students shared their personal stories of overcoming adversity. "This is the beginning," Elijah said quietly, looking around at the sea of blue armbands and excited faces. "This is only the start. We've got a long way to go, but today feels like victory." But as the event unfolded, Elijah couldn't shake the feeling that something was off. The joy, the excitement, it was all there, but so was an undercurrent of tension. Not everyone was as enthusiastic about Unity Day as they pretended to be. As much as the day was a celebration of progress, it was also a reminder of how much still needed to be done. At the center of the school courtyard stood a massive stage, with speakers ready to address the crowd. Elijah had been asked to give the opening speech, a task he had dreaded at first but now felt honored to take on. As he walked toward the stage, the crowd parted, and he noticed the teachers in the back, observing from the sidelines. Mrs. Thompson was there, of course, a proud smile on her face. But there were others, standing stiffly with their arms crossed. The tension between the supporters of the movement and those who had been indifferent, or worse, resistant, was palpable. Elijah climbed onto the stage, the microphone in his hand. He looked out at the sea of students and teachers, and for a moment, everything went quiet. He took a deep breath. This was his moment, not just for himself, but for everyone who had been a part of this journey. He needed to speak not just to those who supported him, but to everyone. He needed to reach the people who still didn't understand. "Good afternoon, everyone," Elijah began, his voice steady but powerful. "I'm Elijah, and today is more than just a school event. It's a reflection of everything we've worked for, the conversations we've started, the boundaries we've broken, and the unity we're building together." He paused, letting the words settle in the air. "I know this hasn't been easy," he continued. "And I know that some of you may still be wondering why we're doing this. You may be asking yourselves, what's the big deal? Why does race and equality matter so much? The truth is, it's because we're all in this together. When one person suffers, we all suffer. When one of us is held back, we're all held back." The crowd was silent, listening intently. Elijah could feel the weight of his words, the responsibility that came with them. Every person in this room deserves to feel safe, to feel seen, and to feel heard. Whether you're black, white, Hispanic, Asian, or anything else, you deserve to be treated with respect. And that's what today is all about, reminding each other that our differences make us stronger, not weaker. As he spoke, Elijah saw the faces of students from different cliques, from the athletes to the artists, the popular kids to the quiet ones, all nodding in agreement. He could feel the shift happening, the change he had been hoping for. But just as the crowd began to stir with energy, a voice from the back of the courtyard interrupted. "Why do we have to keep talking about this?" It was a voice Elijah recognized, Jake, the senior who had approached him the other day with questions about the movement. He was standing with a few of his friends, and his tone was sharp, almost offensive. Elijah's heart sank. He had hoped this moment would go smoothly, but he knew that not everyone would be on board. He took a deep breath, preparing himself for what was coming. "This isn't about complaining or trying to make trouble," Elijah responded, keeping his voice calm. "This is about making sure no one gets left behind. We're not asking for special treatment. We're asking for equality." Jake shook his head. "But it feels like we're all being forced into this. Like we can't just be ourselves without worrying about race all the time." Elijah didn't hesitate. "What we're doing isn't about forcing anyone to change who they are. It's about recognizing that the world we live in has systems that have held some people back for far too long. It's about leveling the playing field so everyone can have a fair shot." Jake was silent, clearly grappling with Elijah's words. But the silence was soon interrupted by a voice that Elijah hadn't expected to hear. "It's about time someone said it." Mrs. Thompson's voice cut through the tension in the air, and she stepped forward. She wasn't just a teacher now, she was a supporter, an ally. "Elijah's right. We've ignored this for too long. And it's time we acknowledged it. Everyone in this room deserves to feel seen and heard." The crowd erupted into applause. It was a small moment, but it felt monumental. Mrs. Thompson had taken a stand, not just as a teacher, but as a human being, a person willing to confront the hard truths and make a difference. As the event continued, Elijah felt a renewed sense of hope. There would always be challenges, always people who didn't understand or who were uncomfortable with change. But today, more than ever, he knew they were on the right path. Later that evening, as the sun began to set, Elijah stood outside the school, looking at the rows of armbands still visible in the crowd. His heart swelled with pride as he realized that this wasn't just a victory for him, it was a victory for everyone who had ever felt marginalized, overlooked, or silenced. The movement wasn't over. But it had taken a powerful step forward. Unity Day had been a success. The event had brought together students, teachers, and even parents in a shared celebration of diversity, inclusion, and equality. Elijah felt a sense of accomplishment that lingered long after the last speaker had left the stage. The whole school seemed to be on the brink of something big, something positive. The movement had spread like wildfire, and for the first time, Elijah could see a future where things might be different, a future where every student could feel equal. But as the days passed, it became clear that not everyone was happy with the changes taking place. As much as the movement had inspired so many, it also had its detractors. Some students, who had once been indifferent, were now actively hostile. The change was uncomfortable for them, and the whispers of resistance grew louder in the hallways. Elijah's biggest concern, however, wasn't just the silent resistance from certain students. It was the threat that had started to take shape in the shadows, something more deliberate and dangerous. It all started with a note. It was a simple piece of paper, slipped into Elijah's locker. He'd been busy with a group of students after school, discussing plans for another event when he noticed the crumpled paper. When he opened it, his stomach turned. "You think you've made a difference, Elijah? You're just stirring the pot. This isn't over, and you won't win." The message was clear. There was someone, maybe even a group of people, who weren't going to sit idly by as Elijah's movement grew. Someone was threatening to undo everything they had worked for. Elijah didn't share the note with his friends right away. He didn't want to worry them or make them think that their efforts were in jeopardy. He stuffed it into his backpack and pretended nothing had happened. But the note kept gnawing at him. The next few days were tense. Elijah began to notice small things. Students who once wore the armband stopped doing so. A few of the students who had been most vocal during Unity Day grew quiet, avoiding him in the halls. He even overheard a conversation in the lunchroom where two students were mocking the movement, calling it a waste of time. The tension was building, and Elijah could feel it in the air, thick and uncomfortable. It was as if the school was holding its breath, waiting for something to happen. The smile that had been on his face after Unity Day slowly faded into a knot of anxiety in his chest. It wasn't long before the situation escalated. One morning, as Elijah made his way to his first class, he spotted a group of students standing by the lockers. They were talking in hushed tones, but the look on their faces told Elijah that something was wrong. He instinctively felt his heart race. These were the same students who had shown no interest in the movement before, but now there was something in their eyes, something unsettling. "Hey, Elijah," one of them called out. It was Jake, the senior who had expressed his doubts during Unity Day. His voice was tight, his expression unreadable. Elijah stopped in his tracks. "What's up, Jake?" "We need to talk," Jake said, stepping closer to him, his friends following behind him. The group was tight-knit, and Elijah could tell they weren't just interested in chatting. There was a heavy silence hanging between them. "What's going on?" Elijah asked, his voice calm but wary. Jake hesitated for a moment before responding. "We're not okay with what you've been doing. This isn't some kind of game. People are getting fed up." The words hit Elijah like a punch to the gut. "What do you mean?" "We're just trying to make things better. To make this place fairer for everyone." Jake's eyes hardened. "You think you can just come in and change everything? The way we've always done things? People aren't happy. You've got people angry. You're pushing too far." Elijah shook his head, trying to understand. "All we're asking for is equality. Why is that so hard for you to understand?" "It's not about equality," Jake snapped, stepping closer. "It's about division. You're dividing us. Making us choose sides. And people don't want that." The tension was palpable. Elijah could feel the weight of every word, but he refused to back down. He couldn't. "Not now. You're the one dividing us, Jake," Elijah said firmly. "By rejecting equality, you're putting us in a place where we can't move forward. You're the one making it harder for everyone to get along." Before Jake could say anything else, the bell rang, signaling the start of the school day. Without another word, Elijah turned and walked toward his class, his mind racing. The threat was real. This wasn't just about students being uncomfortable, it was about something more serious. A small group of people had decided they were willing to fight back against the change Elijah was pushing for. As Elijah sat in class, his mind couldn't settle. He was losing track of the lesson, his thoughts consumed by the growing tension. How had things gotten so complicated so quickly? What had started as a movement for unity was now turning into a battle, one that was more personal and dangerous than he ever anticipated. The day passed in a blur, but the feeling of unease only grew stronger. That afternoon, as he left school, he noticed something else. His car, parked near the school gate, had been scratched. The paint on the side was gouged, the words, "Die," etched into the door. Elijah stood frozen, staring at the damage, his heart pounding in his chest. This wasn't just a prank. This was hate. This was a deliberate attempt to intimidate him. That night, Elijah didn't sleep. The reality of what was happening weighed heavily on him. He knew he couldn't do this alone. He needed to tell his friends, his family, and most importantly, he needed to tell his father. Elijah's dad, Robert, had been supportive of the movement from the start. He'd seen Elijah grow into the young man he was now, passionate, determined, and unafraid to stand up for what he believed in. But Elijah knew that the situation had escalated beyond anything they had anticipated. When his dad got home that evening, Elijah was waiting in the kitchen. Robert looked at his son, sensing something was wrong. "Hey, son. Everything okay?" Robert asked, his voice filled with concern. Elijah didn't hesitate. He pulled out his phone and showed his father the pictures of his car, the scratches, and the hateful message. "I don't know what to do, Dad," Elijah admitted, his voice shaky. "It feels like it's getting worse." Robert didn't say anything for a long moment. He just stood there, his brow furrowed as he studied the pictures. Finally, he spoke. "Son," he said, his voice firm and resolute. "You've done something incredible here. But now, we've got to stand together, as a family, and make sure this stops. No one has the right to silence you or intimidate you. You're not alone in this." Elijah looked at his father, seeing the fire in his eyes. His father wasn't just an ally, he was ready to take action. "You're right," Elijah said, his voice growing stronger. "We have to fight back, not just for me, but for everyone who believes in this movement." The conversation between father and son that night became the turning point. Elijah knew what had to be done. This wasn't just about a few individuals anymore. It was about protecting what they had built, no matter the cost. The next morning, the tension in the air was thick as Elijah walked through the school hallways. His mind was a whirlwind of thoughts, his father's words, the hate-filled scratches on his car, and the note he had found in his locker. It felt as though everything he had worked for was being threatened by forces that were determined to see it all fall apart. The damage to his car wasn't just vandalism. It was a warning, a clear message that someone wanted him to back down, to stop pushing for change. But Elijah wouldn't, let fear control him. Not now. Not after everything he had done, and everything his friends and allies had done to get this far. As Elijah entered the school, his eyes were drawn to the corner where a group of students stood, whispering amongst themselves. He recognized the faces of those who had mocked the movement, the ones who had tried to silence him during Unity Day. Jake was standing at the front of the group, his eyes scanning the hall. Elijah took a deep breath, steeling himself. This was it. The confrontation he had been dreading, but knew was coming. He approached the group, his step steady and purposeful. As he got closer, Jake's eyes flicked over to him, a sneer forming on his face. "Didn't think you'd show up today," Jake said, his voice dripping with disdain. Elijah's gaze didn't waver. "I'm not going anywhere, Jake. You're not going to scare me off." Jake chuckled darkly, taking a step forward. "It's not about scaring you off, Elijah. It's about making you realize that your movement. It's dividing us. Making things worse. We don't need this kind of trouble." Elijah shook his head, his voice calm but filled with conviction. "You don't get it, do you? We're not the ones dividing people. You are. You're choosing to ignore the fact that things haven't been equal for everyone. That's what this is about. Equal treatment." A few students behind Jake shifted uncomfortably, but Jake held his ground. "You're wrong," he said, his eyes narrowing. "We've always been fine. Nothing needs to change." "Nothing?" Elijah said, his voice rising slightly. "Jake, how can you say that? You don't even see what's happening around you. The people you're standing with, they're the ones perpetuating this division. They're the ones making it harder for people like me, people like my friends, to feel safe and equal. I'm not asking for anything that doesn't belong to me. I'm asking for the same thing everyone deserves. Respect." The words hung in the air like a heavy weight. The hallway had grown quiet, and Elijah could feel the eyes of students on him, watching the scene unfold. For a moment, Jake said nothing. His expression faltered, but only for a second, before he quickly regained his composure. "You're wasting your time," he said, his voice low and threatening. You won't win. People will get tired of this whole thing. They'll turn on you. You're wrong, Elijah replied, his voice unwavering. This is about something bigger than all of us. And I'm not backing down. The rest of the day was a blur. Elijah barely paid attention in class, his mind still reeling from the confrontation. It wasn't just Jake he was worried about now, it was everyone who was watching, everyone who was quietly observing the fallout. He knew they were waiting to see which side would win, who would back down first. As the school day came to an end, Elijah headed toward the parking lot, where his dad had promised to meet him. Robert had been quiet all day, but he could sense the concern in his son's voice the night before. They needed to talk about what had happened, about the threats Elijah had been receiving. It wasn't something they could ignore any longer. Elijah found his dad standing next to his car, his arms crossed, a concerned but determined look on his face. "Hey, Dad," Elijah greeted him softly. "Thanks for meeting me here." Robert nodded, his eyes scanning the parking lot. "No problem, son. I can tell this has been tough for you. I've been thinking a lot about everything, and I think it's time we take a stand. I know you've been handling this on your own, but you shouldn't have to do that. You've got people who care about you. We'll face this together." Elijah smiled weakly, his dad's words the comfort, but the weight of the situation still pressed down on him. "What if it doesn't work, Dad? What if they just get more aggressive? What if this all backfires?" Robert placed a firm hand on Elijah's shoulder, his voice steady and resolute. "Sometimes doing the right thing means facing things head-on, even when it's scary. We don't have the luxury of turning back now, Elijah. This is bigger than any one of us." Elijah nodded, feeling the resolve building in him. His father was right. They couldn't let fear dictate their actions. They had to fight, not just for Elijah's future, but for the future of everyone who would come after them. "We've got this," Elijah said, his voice stronger now. "Together, we can make it work." The following morning, Elijah made a decision. He wouldn't let this intimidation define him. He wouldn't allow the hate and fear to control his actions. He would take a stand, not just for himself, but for the movement, for everyone who believed in the cause of equality. That morning, he walked into school with his head held high. The halls were quieter than usual, but he could feel the eyes of students on him as he passed. Whispers filled the air, but Elijah didn't flinch. He didn't look away. He had a mission. Elijah walked straight to the principal's office. He needed to address the threats, the intimidation, and the hate head-on. It wasn't enough to ignore it anymore. The school needed to take responsibility for the actions of the students who were fueling this climate of fear. When he stepped inside, he found Principal Harris sitting at her desk, going over paperwork. "Good morning, Elijah. What's on your mind?" she asked, glancing up at him. "I need to talk to you about something serious," Elijah began. "About the threats I've been getting." The words tumbled out of him as he explained the vandalism to his car, the note, and the confrontation with Jake. He told her about the environment in the school and how it was becoming more hostile. The principal listened intently, her face growing more serious with each passing moment. "I'm glad you came to me with this, Elijah," Principal Harris said, her voice firm. "This behavior won't be tolerated. We're going to take action." Elijah felt a wave of relief wash over him. The school was finally listening. The fight wasn't just his anymore, it was theirs too. As Elijah left the principal's office, he knew things wouldn't be easy from here on out. But he also knew that the fight for change was one worth fighting. And he wouldn't fight it alone. The morning after Elijah's meeting with Principal Harris, things started to change at school. It wasn't immediate, but it was noticeable. Whispers in the hallways seemed to carry less weight, and students who had once avoided Elijah now gave him nods of silent support. It wasn't perfect, there was still tension, but it felt like a shift, like the tide was slowly turning. But Elijah knew it wasn't over. He couldn't relax, not yet. The threat still loomed, and he had no idea what kind of retaliation was coming next. The hard part, Elijah knew, was just beginning. He needed to stay focused and keep pushing forward. "I don't want anyone to get hurt," Elijah said, his voice trembling. "I don't want this to turn into something ugly." Maya placed a hand on his shoulder. "We'll make sure it doesn't. You can count on us." That afternoon, Principal Harris called Elijah into her office. When he entered, he found her sitting behind her desk, her face stern but compassionate. "Elijah," she began, "I've read the letter, and I'm not taking this lightly. I'm pulling in a few resources to ensure this doesn't escalate any further. We need to make sure that all students here feel safe, no matter their race, beliefs, or background. The school won't tolerate any form of intimidation." Elijah nodded, his anxiety somewhat easing. "Thank you, Principal Harris. I don't want to be the cause of more trouble. But I can't back down. Not now." Harris gave him a reassuring smile. "I know you don't want trouble, Elijah. But sometimes standing up for what's right means facing adversity. And you're doing exactly that. Just remember, you have the support of the staff here." Elijah left the office feeling a little more grounded, but the message from the concerned group still echoed in his mind. He couldn't shake the feeling that things were about to escalate. The rest of the week was tense. There were no more letters, no more vandalism, but Elijah could feel the hostility in the air. It was like walking through a pressure cooker, any wrong move, and everything might blow up. It wasn't just the students who were against the movement anymore. It was becoming clear that there were people in positions of power who were quietly opposed to what Elijah and his friends were doing. That Friday afternoon, Elijah met with his closest allies, Maya, Jordan, and his dad. They gathered in the school library, the same place where they had started planning the movement weeks ago. The library, usually a quiet and peaceful place, now felt like the center of a storm. "I can't keep doing this if it means putting everyone at risk," Elijah said, his voice heavy with exhaustion. "I'm afraid that if I keep pushing, things are only going to get worse." Maya shook her head. "Elijah, we're with you. We all believe in what you're doing. This isn't just your fight. We're not backing down, and we won't let them win." Jordan nodded in agreement. "You've already made a huge difference. We've come this far. We can't stop now." Elijah's father spoke up, his voice calm but firm. "Your mom and I raised you to stand for what's right, Elijah. And I'm proud of you for doing just that. But this isn't just about you anymore. It's about everyone who feels they've been treated unfairly. It's about making sure this generation learns that standing up for others is worth every bit of sacrifice." Elijah looked around the table at his friends and family. They believed in him. And for the first time in a long while, he truly believed in himself. "We'll keep going," he said, his voice stronger now. "We have to keep going." That evening, Elijah decided to take the next step. He wanted to let everyone know that he wasn't backing down. It wasn't just for the people at his school, it was for every person who had been silenced by hate or fear. For every person who had ever felt alone in their fight for equality. He posted a message on social media, explaining everything that had happened over the past few weeks. He spoke about the threats, the struggles, and why it mattered. And he ended it with a clear message to everyone. This isn't just my fight. It's all of ours. If we stand together, nothing can stop us. I won't back down. I hope you won't either. The post went viral within hours. Support poured in from students, teachers, and even parents, all sharing their own stories and pledging their support for Elijah and the movement. It was the final confirmation that they were making a difference. As the weekend approached, Elijah's confidence grew. The fight wasn't over. But now, he knew, he wasn't alone. The weeks that followed were a whirlwind of emotions. As Elijah's message spread, so did the ripple effects. The support had been overwhelming, but it didn't stop the backlash. The school was divided, more than ever. The tension was palpable, and Elijah knew the storm wasn't over. This was just the calm before it hit its peak. Every time he stepped into the school hallways, he felt eyes on him. Some were sympathetic, others were filled with anger. There were still whispers, but now they were laced with something else: respect. No one could ignore the strength it took to stand up when it felt like everything was stacked against him. That morning, Elijah was walking toward his first class when he spotted Jake. His old rival was standing with a few friends by the lockers, laughing about something. Elijah's stomach twisted. A part of him hoped things would calm down, but deep inside, he knew that wasn't going to happen. The battle between what was right and what was comfortable for people like Jake was far from over. As Elijah walked past him, he overheard Jake muttering something under his breath. "Just wait. He won't last. He'll break eventually." Elijah kept his head high, ignoring the taunt. Jake's words didn't hurt as much as they used to. There was a sense of purpose inside him now. He had come too far to let people like Jake intimidate him. Still, the threat was there. And Elijah knew that. As confident as he felt in the school's support, he couldn't forget the group behind the letters, the concerned group, as they called themselves. They had been quiet for a while, but Elijah knew they were planning something. After school, Elijah met with his father. It had become routine by now. Robert was always there to listen, to offer advice. They'd shared countless conversations since everything started. But today, there was something different about the conversation. Elijah could see the concern in his father's eyes. "Dad, I'm not sure how much longer I can keep doing this," Elijah confessed, sitting across from him at the kitchen table. "Every time I think we're making progress, something happens that sets us back. It's like I'm pushing against a wall that doesn't want to move." Robert leaned forward, his expression serious but filled with understanding. "Elijah, change doesn't come easily. It's never going to be smooth. But you've already done something huge. You've brought this issue to the surface. And while it may feel like it's pushing you down, remember, it's also lifting others up." Elijah sighed, rubbing his face. "But what if this all ends badly? What if the people who want to stop me get what they want?" "Sometimes, Elijah," Robert said slowly, choosing his words carefully, "the hardest part isn't fighting for what you want. It's fighting for what's right, even when you don't know how it's going to end. You're doing something that matters. And in the end, that's all that counts." Elijah met his father's gaze, feeling the weight of his words. "I know," he said quietly. "But I'm scared. Scared of what they'll do next. Scared that I'll lose everything I've worked for." Robert smiled gently. "Fear is natural. It means you're doing something worth doing. And you've got more than just yourself to think about. You've got the people who believe in you, who stand by your side. And when you're doing this for them, you'll find the strength you need." The next day at school, Elijah arrived to a charged atmosphere. Whispers filled the hallways, but these weren't the usual murmurs. They were louder, more urgent. Something was happening. Something big. As he walked to his locker, Maya rushed up to him, her face pale. "Elijah, you need to see this," she said, grabbing his arm and pulling him toward the cafeteria. When they arrived, a crowd had gathered, murmuring in shock. In the center of the room was a banner, hanging from the rafters. It was crude, hastily written, but it was unmistakable. "Stay out of our school. Go back to where you came from." Elijah's stomach dropped. He didn't even have to ask who had done this. It was the concerned group sending their message loud and clear. Maya looked at him, her face filled with anger. "This is it. They're making their move." Elijah's hands clenched into fists, his body shaking with rage. But as he looked around at the faces in the crowd, something unexpected happened. It wasn't just anger. It was determination. The students who had once been silent, the ones who had avoided taking a side, were now stepping forward. They weren't standing with the hate. They were standing with Elijah. A voice cut through the crowd. Elijah. He turned to see Jake standing at the edge of the group, his hands shoved in his pockets. His face wasn't filled with the smug confidence it usually had. Today, it was filled with something else. Something Elijah couldn't quite read. "You need to stop," Jake said, his voice lower than usual. "This isn't what's best for anyone. You're making people take sides. You're tearing this place apart." Elijah didn't know what to say at first. He had heard Jake's words so many times before, but today they felt different. Today, they didn't scare him. Instead, they felt like an echo of the past, of a time when he might have listened. "You're wrong, Jake," Elijah said, his voice steady. "I'm not tearing this place apart. I'm trying to fix it. People like you are the ones causing division by ignoring the truth." Jake's eyes narrowed. "You really think you're going to change anything? You're one person." Elijah shook his head, feeling the weight of what he was about to say. "I'm not one person anymore, Jake. I'm part of something bigger. And you can't stop it." The fight wasn't over. But Elijah felt something inside him shift. The banner, the threats, the tension, it all paled in comparison to the realization that he had become part of a movement. A movement that wasn't just about one person. It was about the countless people who had been silenced, who had been oppressed, who had been ignored. For the first time in a long while, Elijah felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. He wasn't alone. And with his friends, his family, and the support of his school community behind him, he knew that whatever happened next, he would stand tall. This wasn't just a fight for him. It was a fight for everyone who had ever been overlooked, mistreated, or told they didn't belong. And in that moment, Elijah knew something else too. No matter how hard it got, no matter how many people tried to stop him, this was a fight worth finishing. He wasn't backing down. Change isn't easy. It never has been. But when you stand up for what's right, even when the world seems against you, you create ripples that can turn into waves. Elijah's fight isn't just his own, it's a reminder that we're all part of something bigger. What do you think is the hardest part about standing up for change? Let us know in the comments below, and don't forget to hit subscribe. Together, we can create a future where no one has to fight alone. Hit subscribe and leave a comment with where you're watching from. This story might just spark a new beginning. What's one thing that always pushes you forward, even when things get tough?